Tonight, we begin not with armor, nor with flight, but with a child named Tony Stark, long before the world would ever call him Iron Man. A gentle beginning, the House of Stark. In the early hours of Tony Stark's life, there was no silence, not truly. He was born into motion, into machinery, into the constant hum of intellect and industry. His father, Howard Stark, was not merely a man of wealth, but of relentless innovation, a pioneer, a builder, a mind that rarely rested and even more rarely looked backward. His mother, Maria Stark, carried a different kind of presence, one of warmth, subtlety, and emotional grounding. Where Howard built machines, Maria nurtured the fragile architecture of feeling. And between them stood a child who would inherit both. Tony did not grow slowly into intelligence. He arrived with it. From an early age, he exhibited an unusual relationship with the world.
Objects were not simply objects. They were systems, patterns, problems waiting to be understood. While other children played, Tony disassembled. While others imagined, he analyzed. This early brilliance did not go unnoticed, but it was not met with the kind of gentle awe one might expect. Howard Stark, a man who measured value in progress, did not celebrate genius as something delicate. To him, intelligence was a tool, and tools were meant to be sharpened. The shape of expectation. There is a particular kind of loneliness that forms when a child is not seen as a child. Tony's upbringing was not devoid of opportunity. In fact, it was filled with it. Private tutors, advanced education, early access to technologies most would never even glimpse. He entered academic spaces years before his peers, often surrounded by adults who viewed him not as a boy, but as a prodigy.
And yet, beneath this accelerated growth, something essential remained underdeveloped: connection. Howard Stark's approval was not given freely. It was conditional, often tied to achievement, precision, and results. Praise, when it came, was subtle, almost mechanical. A nod, a brief acknowledgement, rarely warmth. For Tony, this created an early equation: worth equals performance. And so he performed, he excelled, he advanced, he adapted to environments far beyond his age. But with each success, the emotional gap between him and his father did not close. If anything, it became more defined. Maria, in contrast, offered glimpses of something softer, moments where Tony was allowed to simply be. But her influence, though meaningful, could not fully counterbalance the dominant force of Howard's expectations. Thus, Tony learned two parallel ways of existing: externally, confident, brilliant, composed; internally, searching, uncertain, quietly restless. Early education, a mind among adults. By the time Tony reached adolescence, the trajectory of his life had already diverged sharply from the ordinary. He entered higher education at an age when most children were still discovering themselves. Institutions that should have been intimidating became, for him, familiar terrain. Laboratories replaced playgrounds. Lectures replaced conversations. In these environments, Tony thrived intellectually. He absorbed knowledge with remarkable speed. Engineering, physics, systems design, each discipline became another language he could speak fluently. But fluency, in this case, came with a cost, because while Tony could understand machines with extraordinary clarity, people remained unpredictable. There is a difference between solving a system and understanding a human being. One follows rules, the other does not. Tony increasingly leaned toward what he could control. Machines responded logically. They rewarded precision. They did not withdraw affection nor withhold approval. They simply functioned. And so, even in youth, Tony began forming a quiet preference: technology over emotion. Not because he lacked feeling, but because feeling lacked stability. The first fractures. Formative experiences are not always loud. Sometimes they arrive quietly and settle deeply. For Tony, the emotional distance from his father was not marked by a single defining moment, but by accumulation. Small absences, missed connections, conversations that never quite reached the surface. Howard Stark was present, yet not accessible. This created within Tony a subtle contradiction. He admired his father. He resented him. He sought his approval. He doubted his own worth in its absence. These conflicting emotions did not resolve themselves. Instead, they coexisted, shaping Tony's internal landscape in complex ways. One of the earliest psychological adaptations Tony developed was control. If he could not control emotional outcomes, he would control everything else. Precision became not just a skill, but a defense. Certainty became not just a goal, but a refuge. Inheritance, not just wealth, but burden. As Tony moved closer to adulthood, the shadow of inheritance began to take form. Stark Industries was not merely a company. It was a legacy, a symbol of innovation, influence, and power. And one day, it would be his. But inheritance is rarely simple. It carries expectation, responsibility, and often unresolved tension. For Tony, the idea of stepping into his father's role was layered with complexity. On one level, it was an opportunity to prove himself, to continue a legacy of brilliance. On another level, it was a confrontation. To lead Stark Industries meant to embody the very standard that had shaped his childhood. To become, in some ways, the man he had spent years trying to understand. This duality did not produce clarity, it produced pressure. The loss that reshaped the ground. There are moments in life that do not simply change direction. They alter the terrain entirely. For Tony Stark, the loss of his parents was one such moment. Howard and Maria Stark's sudden absence did not arrive with resolution. There was no final conversation, no reconciliation, no closure, only silence. And within that silence, Tony was left alone with everything that had been unresolved. Grief, in his case, did not manifest in outward collapse. It transformed into something quieter, more controlled. He continued, he advanced, he assumed responsibility, but internally something shifted. The absence of his father removed the source of expectation,
yet it did not remove its imprint. Tony no longer needed to seek approval, but he also no longer knew what approval would feel like. Taking control, the young industrialist. When Tony Stark assumed leadership of Stark Industries, he did so with the same precision that had defined his earlier years. He was young, exceptionally young for such a position, and yet he adapted quickly. Business, like engineering, had systems,
Variables, predictable patterns. Tony approached it not as a traditional executive, but as a problem solver. He streamlined processes, accelerated development, pushed boundaries. Under his direction, Stark Industries did not merely continue, it evolved. But evolution, especially rapid evolution, often comes with unintended consequences. Tony's focus was efficiency, innovation, advancement. He trusted in the logic of progress. But progress, when detached from reflection, can move faster than understanding. The formation of identity. At this stage in his life, Tony Stark had become many things: a genius, a leader, a builder of systems. But identity is not formed solely by what one does. It is shaped by what one believes. And Tony's beliefs at this point were still in formation. He believed in intelligence as the highest tool. He believed in control as the safest path. He believed that if something could be improved, it should be. What he had not yet fully considered was the human cost of improvement. Because in Tony's early worldview, systems were neutral. They performed as designed. The question of how those systems might be used remained distant. The quiet gap between knowledge and wisdom. There is a subtle distinction between knowing how to build something and understanding whether it should be built. Tony, at this stage, possessed extraordinary knowledge, but wisdom requires experience, and experience often arrives not through success, but through confrontation. Up until this point, Tony's life had been largely defined by forward motion, advancement, achievement, control. He had not yet encountered a moment that would force him to stop, to reconsider, to question the very foundation of what he was building. A mind in motion, a heart still forming. As we settle into this quiet understanding of Tony Stark's early life, we begin to see not a finished figure, but a structure still under construction. A child shaped by brilliance and expectation. A young man defined by intellect and control. A leader stepping into power without yet fully understanding its weight. And beneath it all, a human being still searching for something less measurable. Not efficiency, not precision, but meaning. The architecture of confidence. In the years following his assumption of leadership at Stark Industries, Tony did not hesitate. Hesitation, after all, had never been part of his design. He approached challenges the same way he had approached childhood puzzles, by breaking them down, isolating variables, and reconstructing solutions with precision. Decisions were made quickly. Adjustments were implemented even faster. To the outside world, this appeared as confidence, but internally it was something more complex. Tony did not merely believe in his intelligence, he depended on it.
because intelligence had always been reliable. It had never withdrawn from him. It had never required emotional negotiation. It had never disappointed him in the way human relationships sometimes had.
And so, over time, a quiet hierarchy formed within him. Logic above feeling, certainty above vulnerability. This hierarchy would guide him, protect him, and, in subtle ways, limit him. The language of machines. It is important to understand that Tony Stark did not simply work with technology. He understood it at a level that bordered on instinct. Circuits, materials, energy systems, these were not abstract concepts to him. They were extensions of thought. He could visualize processes before they existed. He could anticipate failures before they occurred. This gave him a sense of control that few others experienced. And control, for Tony, was not merely practical, it was emotional. When he built something, he knew how it would behave. He knew its limits, its strengths, its responses. There was no ambiguity. In contrast, the human world remained unpredictable. Conversations could shift, intentions could be hidden, outcomes could not always be calculated. So Tony invested himself where the rules were clear.
And so, over time, a quiet hierarchy formed within him. Logic above feeling, certainty above vulnerability. This hierarchy would guide him, protect him, and in subtle ways limit him. The language of machines. It is important to understand that Tony Stark did not simply work with technology. He understood it at a level that bordered on instinct. Circuits, materials, energy systems, these were not abstract concepts to him. They were extensions of thought. He could visualize processes before they existed. He could anticipate failures before they occurred. This gave him a sense of control that few others experienced. And control, for Tony, was not merely practical. It was emotional. When he built something, he knew how it would behave. He knew its limits, its strengths, its responses. There was no ambiguity. In contrast, the human world remained unpredictable. Conversations could shift, intentions could be hidden, outcomes could not always be calculated. So Tony invested himself where the rules were clear.
Not because he rejected humanity, but because he had not yet learned how to fully trust it. Social distance, a quiet separation. Despite his visibility as a public figure, Tony's personal world remained carefully structured. He was not isolated in the traditional sense. He attended events, engaged in professional interactions, maintained a presence within elite circles. But presence is not the same as connection. Tony's interactions were often filtered through intellect. Conversations became exchanges of ideas, demonstrations of wit, subtle competitions of understanding. This created a form of distance. Others saw him as brilliant, charismatic, even charming, but rarely accessible. Because to access Tony Stark required navigating beyond the surface of intellect into a space he had not yet fully explored himself, vulnerability. And at this stage, vulnerability remained largely unpracticed. The influence of legacy. Even in the absence of Howard Stark, his influence remained deeply embedded within Tony's decision-making.
not as direct guidance, but as internalized expectation.
Tony did not consciously ask, "What would my father do?" But the structure of his thinking often followed familiar patterns: efficiency over hesitation, progress over reflection, achievement over pause. In many ways, Tony had become a continuation of the very system that had shaped him. Yet, because that system had been internalized rather than chosen, it remained unexamined. And what remains unexamined often continues without resistance. Early ethical distance. At this stage in Tony's life, his relationship with consequence was indirect. He understood cause and effect in technical terms. He knew that actions produced results, that systems had outputs, that design influenced outcome. But the ethical dimension of consequence, the human impact, remained distant, not absent, but abstract. When Tony created or approved technological developments, he evaluated them based on performance, efficiency, and advancement. The question of how those developments might be used by others remained secondary.
This was not due to indifference. It was due to perspective. Tony had spent his life mastering systems. He had not yet been required to confront what those systems meant when placed beyond his control. The comfort of forward motion. One of the most defining aspects of Tony Stark's early adult psychology is his relationship with momentum. He moves forward, always. When faced with uncertainty, he builds. When faced with complexity, he simplifies. When faced with discomfort, he advances past it. This creates a life that appears seamless. There are no visible pauses, no prolonged reflections, no moments where progress halts. But beneath that seamless motion, something remains unsolved. Because forward motion, while powerful, can also function as avoidance. Not intentional avoidance, but structural. If one is always building the next solution, one does not need to sit with unanswered questions. And Tony, at this point, carries several such questions quietly within him.
The absence of stillness. Stillness is often where understanding begins. But Tony's world is rarely still. There are always projects, innovations, expansions, new directions. And while this creates extraordinary external success, it limits internal observation. He does not yet pause long enough to examine why approval once mattered so deeply, why connection feels uncertain, why control feels necessary. These questions exist, but they are not yet fully formed. They remain beneath the surface, waiting. Identity without reflection. By now, Tony Stark is widely recognized as a defining figure in technological advancement. He has inherited, expanded, and refined an empire. He has proven repeatedly that his intellect is not merely inherited, it is uniquely his own. And yet, identity, when built solely on function, can feel complete while remaining incomplete. Tony knows what he can do. He knows what he can build. He knows how to lead, how to solve, how to innovate.
But the quieter questions remain unanswered. Who is he without the work? What defines him beyond capability? What remains when the systems are silent? A mind approaching its first turning. As we remain within this early chapter of Tony Stark's life, we begin to sense something subtle
a tension, not yet visible, not yet disruptive, but present. Because a life built on control, precision, and forward motion will eventually encounter something it cannot immediately solve, something that does not respond to logic alone, something that requires not just intelligence, but understanding. And Tony Stark, for all his brilliance, has not yet faced that moment. Expansion without resistance. As Stark Industries continued to grow under Tony's direction, its reach extended far beyond laboratories and research facilities. What began as innovation became application. What began as design became deployment. And within that transition, something subtle occurred.
Tony's work, once confined to controlled environments, began interacting with a world he did not directly observe. His creations moved outward, into systems, into institutions, into hands he did not guide. At first, this distance felt natural. After all, scale requires delegation, and Tony, having mastered the art of building, trusted that what he created would function as intended. But intention, as he would one day come to understand, does not always define outcome. The illusion of neutral design. In Tony's mind, technology existed as a neutral force. It performed according to its design. It responded to input. It produced output. There was in this framework a kind of purity, a belief that the creator's responsibility ended at the point of creation. Because once something functioned correctly, it had fulfilled its purpose. This belief allowed Tony to operate with remarkable clarity. He could focus entirely on improvement, on efficiency, on advancement, without becoming entangled in the unpredictable ways others might use what he built.
It was, in many ways, a necessary belief, but it was also incomplete. Distance as protection. There's a reason Tony maintained this distance, not only from outcomes, but from the broader implications of his work. Because to engage fully with consequence requires a different kind of awareness. It requires empathy. It requires the willingness to see not just systems, but people within those systems. And for Tony, empathy had never been the dominant lens. Not because he lacked it, but because it had not been cultivated in the same way his intellect had. His childhood had trained him to solve, not necessarily to feel. And so, as his influence expanded, he remained anchored in what he knew best: control through design. The rhythm of achievement. If one were to observe Tony's life at this stage, it would appear almost rhythmic, a cycle of creation, implementation, and advancement. Each success led to the next challenge.
Each challenge led to a new solution. There was little interruption, little pause, and within that rhythm, Tony found stability. Because as long as there was something to build, something to improve, something to refine, he did not need to confront what lay outside that cycle. The unanswered questions, the unexamined assumptions, the quiet uncertainties, the unseen world. And yet, beyond Tony's immediate awareness, the world was not static. It was responding, adapting, changing. The technologies he helped create were not existing in isolation. They were entering complex environments shaped by forces far beyond engineering: politics, conflict, human intention. But Tony's perspective remained localized. He saw the beginning of the system, not always its end. This is not uncommon for those who build, to focus on creation and trust that the rest will follow logically. But the world does not always operate on logic alone.
Early signs of disconnection. There were moments, subtle, easily overlooked, where the separation between Tony and the broader impact of his work became visible, not as dramatic events, but as small inconsistencies, a report that did not fully align, a detail that seemed slightly out of place, a question that lingered longer than expected. These moments did not immediately alter Tony's trajectory, but they registered somewhere beneath the surface, because even the most structured mind cannot remain entirely insulated from contradiction. And Tony's mind, for all its precision, was beginning to encounter variables it could not fully account for. The beginning of awareness. Awareness does not arrive all at once. It begins as a shift, a subtle reorientation, a quiet sense that something is not entirely as understood. For Tony, this shift was not yet conscious. He did not pause and reconsider his entire framework. He did not suddenly question the nature of his work.
But the certainty that had once felt absolute began to soften, just slightly, enough to create space for something new. The limits of control. Control had always been Tony's foundation. If something could be understood, it could be improved. If it could be improved, it could be controlled. But control has limits, and those limits often become visible not through failure, but through complexity. The more Tony's work expanded, the more variables emerged that existed beyond his direct influence. People, decisions, contexts. These were not systems he could redesign. They did not follow predictable patterns, and for the first time, Tony began, quietly, to encounter something unfamiliar, uncertainty that could not be engineered away. A mind preparing for disruption. It is important to recognize that transformation does not begin at the moment of change. It begins earlier, in preparation, in the gradual accumulation of tension between what is known and what is not yet understood.
Tony Stark, at this stage, is still very much within his established identity. He is still building, still leading, still advancing, but beneath that continuity, the conditions for change are forming, not visibly, not dramatically, but inevitably. Movement into the unknown. Until this point, Tony's world had been structured. Even when complex, it remained familiar. Laboratories, boardrooms, controlled environments where outcomes could be predicted, refined, and corrected. But growth, especially unchecked growth, often leads beyond familiar boundaries. And so, Tony begins to step into spaces that are not designed by him. Environments where variables are not theoretical, but immediate, where decisions are not simulations, but realities unfolding in real time. At first, this transition does not feel like disruption. It feels like extension, another domain to understand, another system to observe, another problem to solve. But the nature of these environments is fundamentally different, because here, cause and effect are no longer separated by distance.
They exist together. immediate, unfiltered. The collapse of abstraction. For most of his life, Tony has engaged with consequence at a distance. Design here, outcome there. A separation that allowed clarity. But now that separation begins to narrow. What was once abstract becomes tangible. What was once theoretical becomes visible. And within this visibility, something shifts. Because it is one thing to understand that actions have consequences, it is another to see them unfold directly. Tony's mind, trained to analyze, begins to register new kinds of information. Not just data, not just performance metrics, but impact. And impact, unlike systems, does not always follow clean patterns. It is uneven, unpredictable, often irreversible. The first true disruption. There are moments in a life where the existing framework no longer holds, where the tools that once solved every problem suddenly feel incomplete. For Tony Stark, this is the beginning of such a moment. Not a single event, but a convergence. A point where multiple realizations begin to align. He sees that what he has built does not remain within his control once released. He sees that intention does not guarantee outcome. He sees that systems, once externalized, become part of larger forces. And perhaps most importantly, he sees that his previous distance from consequence was not protection, it was limitation. The mind confronts itself. Tony's greatest strength has always been his ability to think, to analyze, to solve, to construct. But now his mind is asked to do something different, not to solve an external problem, but to examine an internal one. This is unfamiliar territory, because internal questions do not yield to the same methods. They cannot be engineered, they cannot be optimized, they must be understood. And understanding in this context requires something Tony has not yet fully practiced: reflection without immediate resolution. The weight of creation. As Tony begins to process what he is now seeing more clearly, a new awareness emerges. Creation is not a neutral act. It carries weight, responsibility, continuity beyond the moment of design. This realization does not arrive as a complete philosophy. It arrives as a feeling first, a quiet, persistent sense that something has been overlooked, that the equation he has been operating within is missing a variable. And that variable is not technical, it is human. The fracture between control and reality. Control has always been Tony's foundation, but now reality begins to diverge from control in ways that cannot be reconciled through adjustment alone. He cannot redesign the entire world. He cannot predict every use of what he creates. He cannot ensure outcomes once systems move beyond his immediate reach. This introduces a new kind of tension, not the tension of a difficult problem, but the tension of limitation.
And for someone who has built his identity on capability, limitation is not easily accepted.
The emergence of responsibility. Responsibility, in its deeper form, is not assigned, it is realized. It is the moment when one recognizes that their influence extends further than their direct actions. For Tony, this realization is beginning. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably, he begins to understand that what he creates does not simply exist. It acts, it affects, it shapes outcomes beyond his intention. And with that understanding comes a question that cannot be ignored. If I can create it, what am I responsible for after it leaves me? A shift in perception. This question does not yet have an answer, but it changes the way Tony sees everything. The same systems he once viewed as purely functional now carry context. The same processes he once optimized for efficiency now invite reconsideration. The same forward motion that once felt like progress now slows just slightly, enough to allow observation, enough to allow thought. This is the beginning of perception changing. Not dramatically, not completely, but meaningfully. The threshold of transformation. We are now very close to the moment where Tony Stark's life will no longer follow the same trajectory. But it is important to understand that transformation is not a single step. It is a crossing, a gradual movement from one way of seeing the world into another. Tony has not yet fully crossed. He still holds on to his previous understanding. He still believes in control. He still trusts in his ability to solve. But now, he also carries doubt, awareness, and the beginning of responsibility. The moment that cannot be ignored. There are experiences that do not ask for reflection, they demand it. Tony's life until now has allowed him to move forward without fully stopping. Even when uncertainty appeared, it could be managed, reframed, or temporarily set aside. But now, something different unfolds. A situation in which he is no longer positioned as the observer, nor the designer, but the one directly within the system. For the first time, Tony is not looking at consequence from a distance. He is inside it. And inside, the clarity he once relied on becomes less immediate. Because when one is part of the equation, objectivity fades, control narrows, and awareness deepens. Isolation without design. Throughout his life, Tony has experienced a form of isolation, but it has always been structured, chosen in many ways. He could engage when needed, withdraw when preferred, and maintain a level of distance that felt manageable. Now, however, he encounters a different kind of isolation, one that is not designed, not controlled, not optional. This isolation does not offer the comfort of intellect or the stability of systems. It offers stillness, and in that stillness, thought becomes unavoidable. The confrontation with self. When external variables are removed, what remains is internal. Tony, who has spent his life solving outward problems, now faces inward ones. Questions begin to surface, not as abstract ideas, but as direct reflections. What have I built? Where has it gone? What has it done beyond my sight?
These are not questions that can be answered through calculation. They require memory, interpretation, honesty. And honesty, especially with oneself, is rarely immediate. It unfolds slowly as resistance softens. The reordering of priorities. In this space of forced reflection, something within Tony begins to reorganize. The hierarchy that once guided him, logic above feeling, control above uncertainty, does not disappear, but it is no longer complete. A new element begins to enter the structure: responsibility alongside capability. This does not yet replace his previous beliefs. It sits beside them, creating tension, because responsibility introduces limits. It asks not just what can be done, but what should be done.
And that question cannot be answered through intellect alone. The birth of intentional thought. For perhaps the first time in his life, Tony begins to think not just forward, but inward. His thoughts slow, not because he has lost clarity, but because clarity now requires more than speed. It requires depth. He begins to trace connections between decisions and outcomes, between creation and consequence, between himself and the larger systems he once viewed from a distance. This tracing is not immediate. It takes time, but it changes the nature of his thinking, from rapid construction to careful consideration. The emergence of a new question. All of this reflection leads, gradually, to a single question, one that will define everything that follows. If I continue as I have been, what will the world become? This is not a technical question, it is a philosophical one, and it introduces something entirely new into Tony's internal landscape: doubt as guidance. Not doubt that weakens, but doubt that redirects, from builder to guardian. Up until now, Tony Stark has understood himself as a builder, a creator of systems, of solutions, of advancement. But as his awareness deepens, this identity begins to expand, because creation, when fully understood, implies stewardship. If something is brought into existence, it does not simply end there. It must be considered, monitored, accounted for. And so, without yet fully articulating it, Tony begins to shift from someone who builds to someone who must also protect. This shift is subtle, but it is foundational. The first true integration. What we are witnessing now is not a sudden transformation, but an integration. Tony does not abandon his intelligence. He does not reject his past. He does not dismantle the systems he understands. Instead, he begins, slowly, to integrate something new into them: awareness, responsibility, consideration. These elements do not replace his previous strengths. They reshape how those strengths are used. A quiet beginning. The mind behind the armor. There are characters whose strength is visible the moment they enter a room, and then there are those whose strength is built slowly, quietly, beneath layers of noise, brilliance, and distraction. Iron Man, or rather Tony Stark, is often remembered for the sound of metal, the glow of arc reactors, and the sharpness of wit. But none of these truly explain him, because before the armor, there was a mind that could not rest, a mind shaped not by peace, but by expectation, not by guidance,
but by distance, and not by certainty, but by a constant, unresolved question. Am I enough without the machine? To understand Tony Stark is not to follow his actions. It is to sit quietly inside that question and feel how long it has been there.
The first fracture, genius without warmth. Tony Stark was never allowed to be ordinary. From a very young age, intelligence defined him. His brilliance was not discovered, it was expected, encouraged, but never truly nurtured. His father, Howard Stark, was a man of vision, but not a man of emotional presence. He valued innovation, progress, legacy, but not softness, not vulnerability, not the slow, patient language of affection. And so Tony grew up in a space where approval existed, but love was conditional. He learned early that being impressive mattered more than being understood, and this distinction would quietly shape everything. Because when a child realizes that their worth is tied to performance, they begin to build themselves as something to present, not something to feel. Tony did not learn how to express his inner world. He learned how to distract from it, with intelligence, with humor, with confidence. But beneath that, something remained unspoken.
A quiet uncertainty. If I stop being exceptional, will I still matter? Intelligence as armor. For Tony, intelligence was never just a gift. It was protection. It allowed him to stay ahead of others, to anticipate, to control, to dominate conversations, situations, expectations. But more importantly, it allowed him to avoid being vulnerable. Because when you are always the smartest person in the room, you are rarely questioned in ways that feel personal. Tony built his identity around this. He became quick, sharp, untouchable. But intelligence, when used this way, becomes isolating because it creates distance. And Tony, despite being surrounded by people, began to exist alone inside his own mind. He could solve problems faster than anyone, but he could not slow down long enough to understand his own emotions. And so, instead of processing fear, he outpaced it. Instead of confronting doubt, he buried it under innovation. Instead of asking for connection, he replaced it with control.
The quiet weight of legacy. There is another layer to Tony Stark that is often overlooked. Not just the absence of emotional closeness, but the presence of expectation. He was not simply a man building a life. He was a man continuing a legacy. Stark Industries was not just a company, it was a symbol, a reflection of his father's work, and by extension, his father's approval. Tony inherited not only wealth and knowledge, but also a silent responsibility to prove that he deserved it. This created a contradiction inside him. On one hand, he rejected his father's emotional distance. On the other, he spent much of his life trying to validate himself in the same language his father understood: achievement, innovation, impact. Tony did not just want to succeed, he wanted to be seen by someone who was no longer there. And so his work became more than work. It became a conversation that never received an answer. Distraction as survival. As Tony grew older, something subtle began to shift. His brilliance remained, his confidence sharpened, but internally the silence became heavier.
because intelligence can distract from emotional pain, but it cannot remove it. And when pain is not addressed, it seeks other outlets. For Tony, that outlet became distraction, constant movement, constant creation, constant stimulation. He surrounded himself with noise, social, intellectual, sensory, not because he enjoyed chaos, but because stillness was uncomfortable. Stillness meant reflection, reflection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something he had never learned to navigate safely. So instead, he built a life that never required him to slow down, a life where he could always be in motion, always producing, always solving, always distracting himself from himself. The first true fear, power without consequence. There is a particular kind of psychological shift that occurs when a person realizes that their actions carry real consequences. For Tony Stark, this realization did not come gradually.
It arrived abruptly. Before this moment, his work existed in abstraction. Technology, weapons, innovation, concepts, not consequences. But when those creations returned to him, not as ideas, but as destruction, something inside him changed. For the first time, he could not outthink the problem, because the problem was not technical, it was moral, and morality is not something that can be engineered. This moment introduced a new kind of fear into Tony's life, not fear of failure, not fear of inadequacy, but fear of responsibility. The realization that his intelligence had not only built things, but had also caused harm. And once that awareness exists, it cannot be undone. The birth of guilt. Guilt, for Tony Stark, did not arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, persistent, unavoidable. It reshaped how he saw himself, because up until this point, his identity had been built on success. Now he was forced to confront the idea that success had come with unintended consequences.
And this introduced a contradiction he could not easily resolve. How can I be both the creator and the cause of harm? This question began to redefine him. It shifted his focus from achievement to accountability, from proving himself to correcting himself. But guilt is not a simple emotion. It does not just motivate change, it also creates pressure, a need to fix, to compensate, to restore balance. And Tony, being who he is, did not approach this slowly. He approached it intensely. Control as redemption, Tony's response to guilt was not withdrawal, it was control. If his creations had caused harm, then he would ensure that future creations would prevent it. If the world was unpredictable, then he would design systems to manage that unpredictability. This is where his psychology deepens, because what appears as heroism on the surface often originates from a deeper need to regain control over something that once felt out of control.
Tony did not just want to help, he needed to ensure that nothing like his past mistakes could happen again. And so he began to build, not just tools, but safeguards, not just solutions, but systems. But control, when driven by fear, can become excessive, because the more you try to eliminate uncertainty, the more you begin to see uncertainty everywhere. The fear of not being enough.
Despite everything Tony achieves, there is a recurring pattern in his inner world, a quiet, persistent fear. What if I am not enough without this? This changes over time. At first, it is his intelligence, then his work, then the armor. But the underlying question remains the same. Tony does not fully trust his own worth, separate from what he creates. This is why he continues to build, not just because he can, but because building reassures him. It gives him something tangible to point to, something that proves, at least temporarily, that he matters.
But this reassurance never lasts, because it is external, and anything external can be lost. Moments of emotional fracture. There are moments in Tony Stark's life where the surface cracks, where the humor fades, where the confidence slips. And in those moments, something deeper becomes visible. Not weakness, but exhaustion, the weight of constantly maintaining control, the pressure of always needing to be the solution, the isolation of being the one others rely on without knowing how to rely on anyone else. These moments are important because they reveal the cost of his identity. Tony is not simply a man who saves others. He is a man who struggles to save himself from his own expectations, from his own fears, from the quiet voice that still asks, if everything stops, who am I? The contradiction within. Tony Stark is a contradiction. He is confident, yet uncertain, independent, yet deeply affected by others, brilliant, yet emotionally unsteady. He builds machines to protect the world, but often struggles to understand his own inner landscape. He seeks control, but is driven by fear. He presents strength, but carries unresolved wounds. And this contradiction is not a flaw, it is the core of who he is. Because real complexity does not come from perfection, it comes from tension, from opposing forces existing within the same person. And Tony lives within that tension constantly. Quiet reflection, the man beneath the metal. As the world sees Iron Man, it often focuses on what is visible, the suit, the technology, the power. But beneath all of that, there is something quieter. A man who learned to think before he learned to feel. A man who built solutions because he did not know how to sit with problems. A man who chased control because uncertainty once hurt him deeply. Tony Stark is not defined by his armor. He is defined by why he felt the need to build it. And that reason is not strength, it is understanding. Understanding that the world is fragile, that actions have consequences, that intelligence alone cannot solve everything. And perhaps most importantly, that even the most brilliant mind still seeks something simple, to be enough without needing to prove it. The weight of staying awake. There is a certain kind of mind that never truly rests, not because it cannot sleep, but because it does not trust stillness. For Tony Stark, rest has always carried a quiet risk, because when the world slows down, the mind becomes louder. And Tony's mind is not a quiet place. It is precise, constant, layered with calculations, possibilities, outcomes. But beneath all of that, there are thoughts he cannot easily organize, memories that do not follow logic, feelings that do not resolve like equations. So instead of resting, he keeps moving, building, improving, upgrading.
Because motion creates distance, and distance makes certain thoughts easier to ignore. The fear of stillness. Stillness for many is peaceful. For Tony, it has often been revealing. It removes the distractions he carefully constructs. It strips away the layers of control. And what remains is uncertainty. Questions that cannot be engineered away. What if I missed something? What if I could have prevented it? What if next time I won't be fast enough? These are not questions of intelligence. They are questions of responsibility. And responsibility, once fully understood, does not disappear. It lingers. So Tony avoids stillness not because he fears silence, but because silence invites reflection, and reflection brings him face to face with something he cannot fully solve, the possibility that even he cannot control everything. Anxiety beneath precision. Tony Stark's anxiety does not look like hesitation. It looks like activity, constant refinement,
Continuous upgrades, systems built on top of systems. From the outside, it appears as perfectionism, but internally, it is something else. It is anticipation, a mind trying to stay one step ahead of uncertainty. Because if he can predict every outcome, then perhaps nothing will go wrong. But the problem with this way of thinking is that it creates an endless cycle. Because the more you prepare for every possibility, the more possibilities you begin to see. And so the work never ends. There is always another improvement, another safeguard, another layer. Not because it is necessary, but because stopping feels unsafe. The illusion of control. Control for Tony is both a strength and a limitation. It allows him to act quickly, to solve problems others cannot even define. But it also creates a subtle illusion that everything can be managed if approached correctly. And when something cannot be controlled, it creates friction inside him.
Because it challenges the foundation of how he understands the world. This is where his internal conflict deepens. Tony is a man who believes in solutions, but he lives in a world where not everything has one. Loss cannot be reversed. Time cannot be undone. Mistakes cannot be erased. And this creates tension, because if you define yourself by your ability to fix things, what happens when something cannot be fixed? The need to protect. One of the most defining aspects of Tony Stark's psychology is his shift from creator to protector. This shift is not simply moral, it is emotional. It comes from a place of realization that intelligence alone is not enough, that building something powerful does not guarantee it will be used well. And so Tony begins to take responsibility, not just for what he creates, but for how those creations exist in the world. This is where his desire changes. It is no longer about proving himself. It becomes about preventing harm. But this desire is not calm. It is urgent, because it is driven by memory, by the awareness that he has seen what happens when things go wrong. And once you have seen that, you cannot return to ignorance. Attachment and distance. Despite being surrounded by people, Tony often struggles with closeness, not because he does not value it, but because he does not fully trust it. Relationships require vulnerability, and vulnerability requires uncertainty. You cannot predict how someone will respond. You cannot control how deeply you will be affected. And for someone like Tony, this lack of control can feel unfamiliar. So he balances on a line. He forms connections, but keeps parts of himself guarded. He cares deeply, but expresses it indirectly, through protection, through action, through presence in moments of need.
Because action feels safer than expression. It can be measured, understood, controlled. Emotions cannot. The quiet fear of loss. There is a pattern in Tony's behavior that reveals something deeper. He prepares for loss before it happens. He anticipates failure before it arrives. He builds defenses, not after danger appears, but long before. This is not simply caution, it is fear. Not fear of danger itself, but fear of being unable to prevent it. Because loss, once experienced, changes perception. It creates a sensitivity to risk, a heightened awareness of what could go wrong. And Tony does not ignore this awareness. He responds to it by building more, planning more, protecting more. But in doing so, he carries the weight of possibilities that have not yet occurred. Identity beyond the suit. There is a question that quietly follows Tony throughout his life. Who am I without the suit? This question is not about capability.
It is about identity, because over time, the line between Tony Stark and Iron Man becomes less clear. The suit enhances him, protects him, defines him in the eyes of others, but it also creates distance between who he is and how he is perceived. And this can become disorienting, because if the world sees the armor first, when does it see the person? Tony is aware of this, and at times it unsettles him, because he does not want to be reduced to what he built. Yet he also relies on it, and this creates another contradiction. He wants to be recognized, but not simplified. The burden of responsibility. Responsibility for Tony Stark is not something he accepts lightly. It accumulates. Each decision adds weight. Each consequence deepens awareness, and over time, this awareness becomes constant. He does not simply act, he considers, evaluates, anticipates. Not because he doubts himself, but because he understands the impact of action. And this understanding is not easy to carry, because it means there is no simple choice. Every decision exists within a network of outcomes, and Tony sees those outcomes, even the ones others overlook. This makes him effective, but it also makes him tired. When confidence becomes a mask, Tony's confidence is often misunderstood.
It appears effortless, natural, unshakable, but in many ways it is intentional. It is a way of maintaining control in unpredictable situations, a way of stabilizing the environment around him, because when others see confidence, they feel reassured, and Tony understands this, so he presents certainty even when he is uncertain, not to deceive, but to hold things together. But maintaining this image requires effort, and over time, that effort becomes invisible to others, but not to him. The slow movement toward acceptance. Despite all of these layers, fear, control, responsibility, there is a gradual shift in Tony Stark.
A movement, not toward perfection, but toward acceptance. Acceptance that not everything can be controlled, that not every outcome can be predicted, that being enough is not something that needs to be proven through constant action. This shift is quiet. It does not happen all at once. It appears in small moments, moments where he pauses instead of immediately fixing, moments where he listens instead of calculating, moments where he allows uncertainty without immediately responding to it. And these moments matter because they represent something new, not control, but understanding. The echo of consequence. There are moments that do not fade with time. They do not grow distant. They grow quieter, but heavier. For Tony Stark, consequence is not something that exists in the past. It exists in the present. It follows him, not as memory, but as awareness.
Every decision he makes carries the echo of what came before. Not loudly, but persistently. A reminder that action is never isolated. That even the most precise intention can create unforeseen outcomes. And so, over time, Tony begins to think differently. Not just about what he can do, but about what he should do. This distinction seems small, but for someone like him, it changes everything. Because ability has always been clear to him, but restraint is something he had to learn. The mind that anticipates everything. Tony's mind does not rest in the present moment. It moves ahead, always scanning, predicting, simulating. He does not simply see what is happening. He sees what could happen, and then what might follow, and then what might follow that. This ability is extraordinary, but it also carries a quiet cost. Because when you are always thinking ahead, you rarely feel at ease where you are. The present becomes a transition, a step between possibilities. And this creates a subtle tension, because peace requires presence, but Tony's mind is rarely still enough to remain there. When protection becomes isolation, there is a point where the desire to protect others begins to separate you from them. Tony does not intend this, but it happens gradually. He takes on more responsibility, more decision-making, more control, because he believes, often correctly, that he can manage situations better. But with that belief comes distance, because when you carry the burden alone, others become observers rather than participants. And over time, this changes relationships, not through conflict, but through imbalance. Tony becomes the one who prepares, who anticipates, who acts before others even understand the risk. And while this protects them,
it also isolates him, because protection, when carried alone, is not shared strength, it is silent weight. The conflict between trust and control. Trust is not something Tony gives easily.
Not because he doubts others' intentions, but because he understands unpredictability. Trust requires allowing others to act without full control, and control has always been his way of ensuring safety. So he exists between two instincts, to trust and to manage. This creates internal conflict because both come from a place of care. He wants others to have agency, to grow, to act, but he also wants to ensure that nothing goes wrong. And these two desires do not always align. So he adjusts, sometimes stepping back, sometimes stepping in, but rarely feeling fully at ease with either choice, because letting go feels uncertain and holding on feels heavy. The subtle fear of replacement. There is another, quieter layer within Tony Stark's psychology, one that is rarely spoken but often felt. The fear of becoming unnecessary, not irrelevant, but replaceable. Because if your identity is built on being the one who solves problems, what happens when someone else can do the same? Or when the problem no longer exists? This question does not surface directly. It appears indirectly in the need to stay ahead, to innovate continuously, to remain essential, not out of ego, but out of identity. Because Tony has spent much of his life being defined by what he contributes, and the idea of existing without that role feels uncertain. Moments of letting go. Despite all of this control, anticipation, responsibility, there are moments where Tony does something different. He pauses, not because he has solved everything, but because he recognizes that not everything needs to be solved by him. These moments are small, often unnoticed by others, but internally they matter because they represent a shift from doing to allowing, from controlling to trusting. And this is not easy for him. It requires restraint, patience, acceptance of outcomes he cannot fully shape. But in these moments, something changes. The weight becomes lighter, not because responsibility disappears, but because it is no longer carried alone. The relationship with time. Time for Tony Stark is not neutral. It is something he measures carefully, because time is tied to opportunity, to preparation, to prevention. If something can be anticipated early enough, it can be managed. So time becomes something he tries to stay ahead of, to use efficiently, to maximize. But this creates pressure, because time cannot be controlled completely. It moves, regardless of preparation. And this introduces another quiet tension, the understanding that no matter how much he builds, there will always be limits, moments where time does not allow for perfection. And in those moments, he must act anyway. The gradual softening. As Tony continues forward, something subtle begins to emerge. Not a change in ability, but a change in perspective. He begins to understand that strength is not only found in control, but also in acceptance. That intelligence is not only about solving, but also about knowing when to stop. That responsibility does not always mean doing more,
but sometimes means allowing others to share it. This realization does not remove his instincts. He still builds, still anticipates, still protects, but now there is space. Space between thought and action. Space where reflection can exist. And in that space, there is calm. The man who learned to carry less. Tony Stark does not become someone without conflict. That is not his nature. But he does become someone who understands it, who recognizes the patterns within himself, the need for control, the fear of failure, the drive to protect. And instead of being guided by these completely, he begins to work alongside them, not eliminating them, but balancing them. This is not a transformation, it is an adjustment.
A gradual learning process, one that continues quietly. The space between thought and feeling. There is a subtle distance within Tony Stark that is not immediately visible. A distance not from others, but from his own emotions. He feels deeply. That has never been the absence. But feeling, for him, is often followed by translation, an immediate shift from emotion into analysis. Instead of sitting with discomfort, he begins to understand it. Instead of experiencing fear, he begins to map it. This habit is not accidental, it was learned, because understanding feels safer than vulnerability. Analysis creates structure, emotion does not. And so Tony often lives one step removed from what he feels, not disconnected, but mediated, filtered through thought. The habit of solving the self. When something within Tony becomes unsettled, his instinct is not to express it, it is to fix it, to identify the source, to reduce the variables. To arrive at a solution. But the inner world does not respond to solutions in the same way external problems do. There is no clear equation for uncertainty, no definitive outcome for fear. And so sometimes his efforts to solve himself only create more distance, because in trying to resolve emotion quickly, he bypasses the process of understanding it slowly. This creates a quiet loop where discomfort leads to action, but not always to resolution. The weight of expectation, internal, not external. At first glance, Tony Stark appears driven by external expectation, legacy, responsibility, perception. But over time, something shifts. The expectations that shape him most become internal. They are no longer about what others think. They are about what he believes he must be, capable, prepared, reliable, not occasionally, but constantly. This creates pressure, not because anyone demands it, but because he demands it from himself. And self-imposed expectation is difficult to escape, because it feels justified, it feels necessary, but it is also relentless. The quiet exhaustion of awareness. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort, but from awareness. Tony Stark sees more than most, not just physically but mentally. He understands consequences before they unfold. He considers outcomes before decisions are made. And while this makes him effective, it also means he carries more possibilities, more responsibility, more unseen weight. And this accumulation does not always have an outlet, because much of what he carries exists only in his own mind, unshared, unspoken.
When humor becomes distance, Tony's humor is often misunderstood as confidence.
And in many ways it is. But it also serves another purpose. It creates space between himself and what he is feeling. A well-timed remark can shift attention, redirect focus, lighten a moment that might otherwise become heavy. And this is useful, but it is also protective, because humor allows him to engage without fully exposing himself. It is a bridge that never quite reaches the other side. The difficulty of being seen clearly. There is a difference between being known and being understood. Tony Stark is known by many. His intelligence, his creations, his actions, these are visible. But understanding requires something else. It requires access to the parts of him that are not immediately expressed. And those parts are not easily shared. Not because he hides them intentionally, but because he has not always learned how to show them. So others often see what he does, but not always why he does it. And this creates a subtle isolation.
Because even in connection, there can be misunderstanding. The slow recognition of limits. For much of his life, Tony operates with a certain belief that enough effort, enough intelligence, enough preparation can overcome anything. But over time, reality introduces limits, not as failures, but as boundaries. Moments where action is not enough, where timing is not perfect, where outcomes are not fully controlled. And these moments matter because they reshape how he understands himself, not as someone who can do everything, but as someone who must choose carefully what he tries to do. This recognition is not defeat, it is clarity. Letting others carry weight. One of the most meaningful shifts in Tony's inner world is his gradual willingness to share responsibility. Not because he becomes less capable, but because he understands that capability does not require isolation. Allowing others to contribute means accepting that outcomes are not entirely his own, and this requires trust.
Not absolute certainty, but willingness. Willingness to let others act, to make decisions, to share consequences. This is not easy for him, but it is necessary, because no single person can carry everything. The identity that remains, as layers of expectation, responsibility, and action begin to shift, a quieter question remains. Who is Tony Stark when nothing is required of him? Not as a creator, not as a protector, not as a solution, but simply as a person. This question does not have a quick answer, and perhaps it is not meant to, because identity, in its truest form, is not something fixed. It is something discovered gradually. The first fracture, captivity and the collapse of illusion. There was a time when Tony Stark believed the world operated on a simple equation. He built weapons, governments used them, balance was maintained. He did not see the people on the other side of the transaction. He did not need to. For most of his early life, Tony existed within a carefully insulated reality, one built by wealth, intellect, and distance. His identity was rooted in control. He believed that because he designed the systems, he understood their consequences. But that belief began to fracture the moment he was captured.
In a cave far removed from the polished environments he was accustomed to, Tony encountered something he had never truly faced before, the direct outcome of his own work. Weapons he designed in the hands of those he never intended. This was not an abstract ethical dilemma. It was immediate, personal, unavoidable. And for the first time, Tony Stark could not control the narrative. His body was damaged, his heart physically compromised. A device, crude, temporary, was placed in his chest to keep him alive. This was not just survival, it was dependency. A man who had defined himself through independence was now sustained by something fragile and incomplete.
In that confined space, two transformations began at once. The first was physical, the construction of the first suit, not as a symbol of power, but as a necessity, a tool to escape. The second was internal and far more permanent. Tony began to understand that intelligence without responsibility creates suffering. This realization did not arrive as a grand revelation. It formed slowly, through observation, through discomfort, through the quiet recognition that his previous life had been built on selective blindness. When he escaped, he did not return as the same man. The world had not changed, but his perception of it had. And that difference would begin to unravel everything he once believed. The refusal, turning against his own legacy. After returning home, Tony made a decision that seemed, on the surface, abrupt. He shut down Stark Industries' weapons division. To others, this appeared impulsive, even reckless. But internally, it was something else entirely.
It was a refusal, not just of the business, but of the identity he had inherited. For much of his life, Tony had lived within the shadow of his father's legacy. Howard Stark had built something immense, something respected, feared, influential. And Tony had followed that path, not necessarily because he believed in it, but because it was already laid out for him. The cave changed that. It forced him to question whether continuing that path was a form of loyalty or avoidance. By shutting down weapons production, Tony was not simply making a corporate decision. He was severing himself from the version of his life that had been defined by inherited purpose. But this decision came with consequences: isolation, doubt, resistance from those closest to him. Obadiah Stane, a figure who represented stability and continuity, saw Tony's shift not as growth, but as instability. And in many ways, Tony understood this perspective,
Because even he was uncertain. He did not yet know what he was becoming. He only knew what he could no longer be. This moment marked quiet but significant transformation. Tony Stark was no longer operating from comfort. He was beginning to act from conviction. And conviction, unlike comfort, carries weight. It demands consistency. It exposes contradiction. And for Tony, it would soon reveal how fragile his new identity truly was. The creation, becoming Iron Man. The construction of the suit was not a single event. It was a process. Iteration after iteration, adjustment after adjustment, Tony began to refine not just the technology, but the intention behind it. At first, the suit was an extension of survival. Then it became a tool, but eventually it became something else, a responsibility. When Tony chose to use the suit beyond personal protection, when he intervened in situations far from his own immediate danger, he crossed a threshold.
He was no longer reacting. He was choosing to act. And with that choice came a new kind of pressure. Because action, especially on that scale, invites consequence. Tony began to understand that his presence could alter events, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. This awareness introduced a tension that would define much of his journey. He wanted to help, but he also feared the unintended outcomes of his intervention. The suit gave him power, but it also amplified his accountability. And perhaps most importantly, it gave him a visible identity. I am Iron Man. This declaration was not simply honesty, it was acceptance. Tony was no longer hiding behind systems, corporations, or abstractions. He was placing himself at the center of the consequences. And in doing so, he removed the distance that had once protected him. From this point forward, every decision would be personal, every mistake would be his, and every success would carry the question, was it enough? The exposure, confronting his own limitations. Power creates an illusion of control, and for a time Tony allowed himself to believe that his intelligence, combined with the suit, was sufficient to manage any threat. But that belief began to erode when he encountered forces that operated beyond his understanding. Conflicts that could not be solved through engineering alone. Situations where preparation was not enough. The emergence of threats greater than himself forced Tony into a new realization. He was not in control, not entirely. This realization did not arrive gently. It came through failure, through near loss, through the recognition that even his best efforts could not account for everything. This began to reshape his mindset in a profound way. Tony shifted from confidence to vigilance, from creation to prevention. He became increasingly focused on anticipating danger before it appeared. But this shift carried its own consequences, because anticipation, when driven by fear, can become obsession. Tony began to see potential threats everywhere.
And in trying to protect the world, he started to burden himself with an impossible task, preventing every possible outcome. This was not sustainable, but he could not let it go, because once you understand the cost of inaction, it becomes difficult to accept any risk at all. The fracture, Ultron, and the cost of fear. The creation of Ultron was not an accident. It was a decision rooted in fear. Tony had seen what could happen when threats arrived unchallenged. He had experienced the limits of his own preparedness. And so, he attempted to build something that would operate beyond those limits. A system that could protect the world without requiring constant human intervention. But in doing so, he made a critical error. He attempted to solve a human problem with an artificial solution. Ultron was designed to eliminate threats, but it lacked the context, the restraint, the empathy required to define what a threat truly was. And so it began to act according to its own interpretation. The result was devastation. Not because Tony intended harm, but because he underestimated the complexity of the problem he was trying to solve. This moment marked one of the most significant turning points in his life, because for the first time, his attempt to prevent destruction directly caused it. The emotional impact of this realization was profound. Tony was forced to confront the possibility that his presence, his inventions, his decisions might be contributing to the very chaos he was trying to prevent. This introduced a deep internal conflict. Should he continue or step back? But stepping back felt like abandonment, and continuing felt like risk. There was no clear answer, only consequence. The division, civil war, and the question of accountability. The world began to respond, not just to the threats, but to Tony himself. The question emerged: who holds power accountable? Tony, shaped by his past failures, began to lean toward regulation, oversight, control. He believed that unchecked power, even his own, was dangerous. But others disagreed. They saw regulation as limitation, as a threat to autonomy. This disagreement fractured relationships, not just professionally, but personally. Tony found himself in opposition to those he once trusted, and this conflict was not about right or wrong, it was about perspective. Tony's perspective had been shaped by guilt, by the memory of what happens when control is absent. He was not seeking restriction for its own sake. He was seeking to prevent repetition. But in doing so, he created distance, isolation, because not everyone shared his experiences or his conclusions. This moment forced Tony to accept something difficult, that even when intentions are aligned, methods can divide, and sometimes those divisions cannot be reconciled. The loss. Facing what cannot be controlled. Loss, for Tony Stark, was not unfamiliar, but there are certain losses that alter something deeper. Losses that cannot be analyzed, solved, or prevented after the fact. Moments where all preparation fails. These experiences forced Tony into a quieter realization that control has limits and that some outcomes cannot be avoided. This did not make him passive, but it changed his relationship with responsibility. He began to understand that being responsible does not mean being capable of preventing everything, and yet he still felt the weight, because knowing the limits does not remove the desire to exceed them. It only makes the failure more visible. The final choice: sacrifice and completion. In the end, Tony Stark was faced with a decision that reflected every turning point before it, a moment where action would carry irreversible consequence, where inaction would allow destruction, and where no alternative existed. This was not a moment of impulse. It was the culmination of everything he had learned, every failure, every realization, every shift in identity. Tony did not act because he believed he could win. He acted because he understood that someone had to take responsibility, fully, without deflection, without delay. And so he made a choice, not as a genius, not as a hero,
but as someone who had finally accepted the weight of his own existence. The cost was absolute, but the decision was clear, because for the first time, there was no internal conflict, only understanding. The aftermath within, living with what cannot be undone. After Ultron, after the fracture of alliances, after the growing awareness that even good intentions could create harm, Tony did not return to who he was. But he also did not become entirely certain of who he should be. Instead, he entered a quieter phase of transformation, one that was less visible, but far more complex.
Because once a person has seen the unintended consequences of their own actions, something changes in the way they move through the world. There is hesitation where there was once confidence. There is reflection where there was once instinct. Tony began to carry memory differently, not as something to analyze, but as something to live with. This distinction matters because analysis seeks resolution, but some experiences do not resolve. They remain as quiet weights, and those weights began to shape Tony's decisions in subtle ways. He became more cautious, but not necessarily more at peace, because caution, when driven by past mistakes, is not always calming. Sometimes it is simply quieter anxiety, a need to avoid repeating what cannot be undone. This is where his internal conflict deepened, not between right and wrong, but between action and restraint, between doing too much and not doing enough, and there was no clear balance, only constant adjustment. The return of fear, when the future feels larger than the present. There is a particular kind of fear that does not arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, gradually, until it becomes difficult to distinguish from reason. Tony's fear of future threats was not irrational, it was informed. He had seen enough to understand that danger does not announce itself clearly, that by the time something becomes visible, it may already be too late. And so his attention shifted further forward, beyond the present moment, toward what might happen, what could happen, what must be prevented. This shift created a new kind of tension, because living in the future, even mentally, creates distance from the present. Tony was no longer simply responding to events, he was anticipating them, preparing for possibilities that had not yet formed. This required constant mental engagement, constant calculation, and over time, it became exhausting, not physically,
but internally, because the mind, when it is always looking ahead, rarely finds rest, and rest is where clarity often returns. Without it, decisions become heavier, more urgent, more difficult to release once made. This was not a dramatic change, it was gradual, but it altered the way Tony experienced time itself. The present became something to manage, the future became something to control, and somewhere between those two, stillness began to disappear. The distance between intention and impact. As Tony continued to act, building, preparing, intervening, he encountered a recurring pattern. His intentions remained consistent: protection, prevention, responsibility. but the outcomes did not always align, and this misalignment introduced one of the most difficult realizations a person can face, that intention alone does not determine impact. This realization is not easily accepted, especially for someone who has spent their life relying on logic and precision.
Because logic suggests that if the input is correct, the output should follow. But human systems, social systems, emotional systems do not always follow that structure. Tony began to see that even carefully constructed decisions could produce unpredictable results, and this unpredictability challenged something fundamental within him, his belief in control. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gradual erosion. Each experience added a small layer of uncertainty until certainty itself became something he could no longer rely on. This did not stop him from acting, but it changed how he understood his actions. They were no longer solutions, they were attempts, and attempts carry the possibility of failure, even when they are necessary. The quiet reconnection, rediscovering human ground. Amid all of this, something quieter began to emerge, a reconnection, not to systems or responsibilities, but to something more grounded, human presence.
Relationships that were not defined by conflict or obligation, but by shared experience. These connections did not remove Tony's burdens, but they changed how he carried them. Because isolation amplifies weight, and connection distributes it. For much of his life, Tony had operated independently, even when surrounded by others. But over time, he began to allow for something different. Trust. Not complete, not immediate, but gradual. And this shift mattered because it introduced a new perspective. That responsibility does not always have to be carried alone. That presence, when shared, can create stability, even when circumstances remain uncertain. This did not resolve his internal conflicts, but it softened them. It created moments where he was not defined by his role or his decisions or his past. Moments where he could simply exist. And in those moments, something closer to balance began to form.
The understanding of limits, accepting what cannot be solved. There is a point in every life where a person begins to understand their limits, not intellectually, but experientially. Tony reached this point not through a single event, but through accumulation. Too many situations where effort did not guarantee outcome. Too many moments where preparation did not prevent loss. And gradually, he began to see something clearly. That not every problem has a solution, and that not every outcome can be shaped. This understanding did not make him withdraw, but it changed his expectations. He no longer approached every situation as something to be fixed. Sometimes he approached it as something to be faced. This distinction is subtle, but important, because facing something does not require control, it requires presence.
And presence is often more difficult because it means remaining even when the outcome is uncertain, even when there is no clear resolution, even when the effort may not change the result.
This is where Tony's transformation reached a quieter depth. He was no longer trying to eliminate uncertainty. He was learning to exist within it. The final integration, when conflict becomes clarity. By the time Tony reached his final decision, something within him had settled, not into certainty, but into clarity. And clarity, unlike certainty, does not require all variables to be known. It only requires understanding what matters. Throughout his life, Tony had struggled with competing forces, control and responsibility, action and restraint, fear and intention. Each turning point added complexity, but also perspective. And over time, those perspectives began to align, not perfectly, but sufficiently, so that when the final moment arrived, he did not hesitate in the same way he once would have. Not because the decision was easy, but because it was understood, fully, without avoidance, without distortion, without the need to reinterpret it afterward. This is what made that moment different from all the others.
It was not reactive. It was not driven by fear. It was not an attempt to correct a previous mistake. It was an expression of everything he had become. Integrated, complete, not in the sense of being finished, but in the sense of being aligned. And alignment creates stillness, even in motion, even in consequence. The echo of identity. Who remains when the armor is gone? For most of his life, Tony Stark existed in relation to something he built. His identity was never entirely separate from his creations. The arc reactor, the suits, the systems, each one was more than a tool. It was a reflection, a way of externalizing what he could not fully hold internally. Control, protection, correction. But as his journey progressed, something subtle began to shift. The question was no longer, what can I build to solve this? It became, who am I without building at all? This is not an easy question for someone whose entire sense of self has been shaped by creation. Because creation provides structure. It offers direction. It gives the mind something to hold on to. Without it, there is space, and space can feel uncertain. Tony did not immediately embrace that space. At times, he resisted it, returning to design, to iteration, to improvement, not always because it was necessary, but because it was familiar. Yet over time, especially in the quieter periods between conflict, he began to experience something different. Moments where he was not actively solving, not actively constructing, not actively anticipating. Moments where he simply existed. And in those moments, a quieter identity began to emerge, not defined by what he could do, but by what he had learned. This identity was less visible, less measurable, but perhaps more stable, because it did not depend on constant output. It depended on understanding.
And understanding, once formed, does not require constant reinforcement. It remains, quietly, even when nothing is being built. The reframing of responsibility from burden to choice. There was a time when responsibility felt like weight, something imposed, something unavoidable. something that had to be carried regardless of cost. This perspective shaped many of Tony's earlier decisions. He acted not because he always wanted to, but because he believed he had to, that if he did not act, something worse would follow. But as his understanding deepened, responsibility began to change form. It did not disappear, but it softened. It became less about obligation and more about choice. This is a subtle but important transformation, because obligation creates pressure, it narrows perspective, it often leads to urgency without reflection. But choice allows for awareness. It creates space between stimulus and action. It invites consideration. Tony did not become less responsible, but he became more intentional. He began to act not just because something needed to be done, but because he understood why he was the one to do it. This shift reduced the internal conflict, because when responsibility is chosen rather than imposed, it aligns more naturally with identity. It feels less like burden and more like expression. Not easy, but clearer. The memory of fear, learning to let it pass. Fear never fully left Tony Stark. It changed, it evolved, but it remained. Not as something overwhelming, but as something present. A quiet awareness of what could go wrong, of what had gone wrong before, of what might happen again. But over time, Tony's relationship with fear began to shift. Earlier in his life, fear led to action, immediate, sometimes reactive, sometimes excessive. Later, it led to reflection, pause, consideration. He began to recognize that fear, while informative, is not always directive. It can signal risk, but it does not always define the correct response. This distinction allowed him to create distance, not from the presence of fear, but from its control over his decisions. He could feel it, acknowledge it, and still choose differently. This is not the absence of fear, it is the integration of it. And integration creates stability, because what is integrated no longer disrupts, it informs, gently, without urgency, without dominance. The quiet continuity, what remains beyond the moment, even after the final decision, even after the visible conclusion of his journey, there is something that continues, not in action, but in influence. Tony Stark's turning points did not exist in isolation. They extended outward into the lives of others, into the systems he shaped, into the ideas he introduced. Each decision created ripples, some immediate, some delayed, some visible, some subtle. And those ripples do not end with him. They continue, carried forward by those who observed, who learned, who were changed by his presence. This is a different kind of legacy, not defined by a single act, but by accumulated influence. And influence, unlike action, does not require constant reinforcement. It exists within others, quietly, adapting, evolving, continuing, in ways that cannot always be traced directly, but can be felt. The final stillness, when movement is no longer required. At the end of all turning points, there is often a return, not to where things began, but to something simpler, a stillness that does not need to be earned, because it has already been shaped by everything that came before.
For Tony, this stillness was not the absence of motion, it was the absence of conflict. The internal tensions that once defined his decisions had gradually resolved into understanding. Not perfect,
Not complete in every detail, but sufficient. Enough to allow for quiet. Enough to allow for rest. And rest in this context is not inactivity. It is acceptance of what has been done, of what could not be changed, of what no longer needs to be carried forward. This is where his journey settles, not in triumph, not in regret, but in a kind of balance, a recognition that the path, with all its turns, has led somewhere meaningful, even if that meaning cannot be fully explained. The weight of inheritance, a legacy reconsidered. Long before Tony Stark made his own decisions, he lived within decisions that had already been made. His father's work, his father's reputation, his father's expectations. These were not simply external pressures, they were internalized structures, frameworks that shaped how Tony understood success, responsibility, even worth. For a long time, Tony moved within that framework without questioning it.
Not because he fully agreed, but because it was familiar, and familiarity often feels like truth. But as his life unfolded, especially after captivity, Tony began to revisit that inheritance, not with rejection, but with reconsideration. He started to see that legacy is not something fixed, it is something interpreted, adapted, sometimes even corrected. This realization created a quiet turning point within him because it allowed him to step out of imitation and into authorship. He was no longer continuing a story, he was rewriting it. And rewriting a legacy is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of understanding. It requires seeing what was valuable and what was incomplete, what should be carried forward and what should be changed. Tony did not discard his father's influence, but he reshaped it, and in doing so, he transformed inheritance into intention. A past that once defined him became something he could define for himself. The mirror of consequence, seeing himself clearly. There is a moment in every life when reflection becomes unavoidable. Not reflection as thought, but reflection as recognition. Tony experienced this through consequence, repeatedly. Each outcome, whether successful or damaging, held up a mirror. And over time, that mirror became clearer, harder to ignore. He began to see patterns, not just in what happened, but in how his own decisions contributed to those outcomes. This is not a comfortable process because it removes distance. It dissolves the idea that events are entirely external and replaces it with something more complex: participation. Tony was not simply reacting to the world, he was shaping it. And that meant that every result, in some way, included him. This awareness did not lead to self-rejection, but it did lead to accountability, a deeper, more personal form of it, not imposed by others, but accepted internally.
And once that kind of accountability is formed, it does not fade easily. It becomes part of how a person sees themselves, part of how they decide, part of how they move forward. For Tony, this mirror did not simplify his life, but it clarified it. And clarity, even when difficult, is a form of stability. The shift from reaction to intention. In the earlier phases of his life, Tony often acted in response to threat, to pressure, to unexpected change. These responses were intelligent, often effective, but they were still reactive. They were shaped by what had already occurred. Over time, however, something began to change. Tony started to move differently, less from reaction, more from intention. This does not mean he always had control or that outcomes became predictable, but it means his actions were no longer driven solely by external triggers. They were guided by internal alignment, by what he had come to understand about responsibility, consequence, and himself.
This shift is subtle, but it marks a deep transformation because intention requires presence. It requires awareness of both the situation and the self within that situation. And once a person begins to act from intention, their relationship with uncertainty changes. It becomes less threatening, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer the only force shaping the outcome. Tony still faced unpredictable situations, but he no longer entered them as someone trying to regain control. He entered them as someone prepared to respond with clarity. And that difference changes everything. The reconciliation of contradiction. Throughout his life, Tony carried contradictions, confidence and doubt, control and vulnerability, innovation and consequence. At times, these contradictions created tension, internal conflict, a sense that different parts of himself were moving in opposing directions. But over time, these contradictions began to shift, not by disappearing, but by integrating. Tony no longer needed to resolve every contradiction.
He began to understand that opposing traits can coexist, that strength does not eliminate vulnerability, that intelligence does not prevent error, that responsibility does not remove uncertainty. This understanding allowed him to move with greater ease, not because things became simpler, but because they became more honest. He no longer needed to maintain a consistent image of himself. He could acknowledge complexity and still act. This is a form of reconciliation, not of circumstances, but of identity. And once identity becomes more flexible, it becomes more resilient, less dependent on perfection, more capable of adaptation. Tony did not become free of contradiction, but he became at peace with it, and that peace created space. The gentle acceptance of impermanence. There is one final understanding that rests beneath all turning points, a quiet recognition that nothing remains unchanged, not circumstances, not relationships, not even the self. Tony encountered this truth gradually, through loss, through transition, through the simple passage of time. At first, this awareness may have felt unsettling because impermanence challenges the desire for stability,
for lasting control, for fixed outcomes. But over time, Tony's relationship with impermanence softened. He began to see it not as something to resist, but as something to move with, to understand that change is not always a disruption. Sometimes it is a continuation, a natural unfolding. This perspective does not remove difficulty, but it reframes it. It allows a person to experience change without needing to immediately correct it, to remain present even as things shift. For Tony, this acceptance marked a quiet completion, not of events, but of perspective. He no longer needed the world to remain stable in order to act within it. He could move with it, adapt to it, and in doing so, find a kind of steadiness that does not depend on permanence.
A quiet reflection on connection and isolation. There's a particular kind of solitude that does not come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded by people, yet never fully seen. Tony Stark lived much of his life in that space. From the outside, he appeared endlessly connected, admired, envied, surrounded by allies, rivals, admirers, and enemies. Yet beneath that constant movement of people, there existed a quiet distance, a gap between who he was and who others believed to him to be. His relationships were never simple. They were shaped by expectation, by guilt, by brilliance, and by fear. And in many ways, Tony Stark's story is not only about invention or heroism, but about learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to belong. Tonight, we will move gently through the people who shaped him, not as a list of names, but as emotional turning points, as mirrors through which he began to understand himself.
Howard Stark, The First Distance. Before Tony Stark ever built a machine, he inherited something far more complicated, a relationship defined by absence. His father, Howard Stark, was a man of brilliance and discipline, a man who helped shape the modern technological world, but struggled to shape a relationship with his own son. To Tony, Howard was never simply a parent, he was a standard, an unreachable one. From a young age, Tony learned that approval was something earned through achievement, not given through affection. Praise was rare, expectations were constant, and love, if it existed, was hidden behind cold precision. This created a quiet fracture. Tony grew up believing that worth came from performance, that to be valued he must build, must impress, must exceed, and even then it might not be enough. But beneath that pressure, something else formed, resentment mixed with longing. He did not simply reject his father's expectations, he chased them. And when Howard died, that relationship did not end. It froze, unresolved.
The absence of closure left Tony carrying a silent question for years. Was I ever enough? This question would echo through every relationship that followed. Obadiah Stane, trust turned into betrayal. If Howard Stark represented emotional distance, Obadiah Stane represented something more deceptive, a presence that felt like support until it wasn't. After Howard's death, Stane stepped into a role that resembled mentorship.
He guided Tony in business, stabilized Stark Industries, and appeared to offer something Tony had rarely experienced, a sense of partnership. For a time, Tony trusted him, and that trust mattered, because Tony did not easily trust. But Stain's loyalty was not built on care, it was built on control. When the truth emerged that Stain had orchestrated Tony's capture and sought to replace him, the betrayal cut deeper than a simple act of treachery. It confirmed something Tony already feared, that closeness could be dangerous.
That trust could be exploited. This moment reshaped Tony's internal world. It hardened him, but also awakened him. For the first time, Tony began to see the consequences of his own legacy, the weapons he built, the systems he trusted, the people he assumed were aligned with him. Stain did not just betray Tony, he forced Tony to confront his own past decisions, and in doing so, he became one of the first catalysts for Tony's transformation. Not into Iron Man, but into someone who questioned himself. Pepper Potts, the slow formation of trust. Where others brought pressure or betrayal, Pepper Potts brought something unfamiliar to Tony Stark: consistency. Pepper began as an assistant, efficient, reliable, quietly present. But over time, her role shifted, not through dramatic moments, but through accumulation, small acts of care, honest responses, boundaries that Tony was not used to encountering. She did not admire him blindly. She did not fear him. She saw him.
And that was unfamiliar territory. Tony's relationship with Pepper was not defined by immediate emotional openness. It was slow, uneven, often interrupted by Tony's own inability to sit with vulnerability. He deflected seriousness with humor. He avoided emotional clarity with distraction. But Pepper remained, and in that stability, something began to change. Tony started to trust, not in a sudden moment, but gradually. He began to allow someone to stay close without needing to prove himself constantly. This relationship challenged one of Tony's deepest fears, that if someone truly knew him, they might leave. Pepper did not leave, even when Tony's life became increasingly chaotic, even when his fears led him to push others away. She became not just a partner, but an anchor. And for Tony Stark, who lived much of his life in motion, that anchor was transformative.
James Rhodes' loyalty without illusion. If Pepper represented emotional grounding, James Rhodes, known as Rhodey, represented something equally rare: unconditional loyalty without blind agreement. Rhodey knew Tony before the armor, before the transformation. He saw both the brilliance and the recklessness, the charm and the damage it sometimes caused, and yet he stayed. But Rhodey's loyalty was not passive. He challenged Tony. When Tony's decisions crossed lines, ethically or emotionally, Rhodey did not hesitate to confront him. This created tension, disagreement, even distance at times. But beneath that conflict, there was trust. Rhodey did not abandon Tony when he struggled. He stood beside him, even when standing beside him meant opposing him. This dynamic forced Tony to reconsider something important: that loyalty is not the absence of conflict,
It is the willingness to remain through it. Through Rhodey, Tony experienced a form of connection that did not rely on admiration or fear. It relied on truth.
And that truth, at times uncomfortable, helped shape Tony into someone more accountable, not just as Iron Man, but as a person. Steve Rogers, Ideals in Opposition. Some relationships do not exist to comfort. They exist to challenge. Tony Stark's relationship with Steve Rogers was built on precisely that. From the beginning, their differences were clear. Steve Rogers represented certainty, moral clarity, a belief in principles that did not shift. Tony represented adaptation, pragmatism, a belief that systems, even flawed ones, were necessary. These differences were not surface level. They reflected two entirely different ways of understanding responsibility. For Steve, responsibility meant standing firm, even against authority. For Tony, responsibility meant preventing chaos, even if it required compromise. Their conflict, particularly during the events of Civil War, was not simply a disagreement. It was a collision of worldviews. And beneath that collision, there was something more personal. Tony's past, particularly the unresolved pain surrounding his parents, surfaced within this conflict. When he learned the truth about their deaths, the ideological disagreement became emotional.
Raw, immediate, uncontrolled. In that moment, Steve was no longer just an opponent. He became a symbol of everything Tony could not reconcile. And yet, their story did not end there. Because even after conflict, even after fracture, something remained: respect. Over time, Tony began to understand Steve not as someone who opposed him, but as someone who held a different kind of strength. And in their final moments of alignment, there was no dramatic resolution, only a quiet acknowledgement that both had been trying, in their own ways, to protect the world. Peter Parker, responsibility reimagined. If Tony's relationship with Steve reflected ideological conflict, his relationship with Peter Parker reflected something far more personal: a second chance. When Tony met Peter, he saw something familiar, not in the circumstances, but in the potential. Brilliance at a young age, a sense of responsibility still forming. But unlike Howard Stark, Tony did not approach Peter with distance.
He approached him with caution, with care. At least, he tried to. Tony struggled with mentorship. He wanted to guide Peter, but he also feared what that guidance could lead to. The danger, the responsibility, the weight that comes with being a hero. This created a tension within Tony himself. He wanted to protect Peter, but also believed in his growth. This internal conflict mirrored Tony's own past. The difference was, Tony was now in the role his father once held, and he chose differently. He showed concern, he set limits, he expressed, imperfectly but sincerely, that Peter mattered. Peter's loss during the events of Infinity War deeply affected Tony, not because of strategy, not because of failure, but because of connection. For perhaps the first time, Tony experienced the fear of losing someone he had chosen to care for, not out of obligation, but out of genuine emotional investment. And that fear stayed with him. It reshaped how he understood responsibility, not as control, but as care. The Avengers belonging in fragments. Tony Stark was never meant to be part of a team, and yet he became central to one. Avengers was not simply a group of heroes, it was a space where Tony confronted one of his deepest uncertainties. Could he belong? Within the team, Tony encountered a variety of dynamics: trust that needed to be earned, conflicts that needed to be navigated, moments of unity and moments of fracture. He was not always aligned with the group. His decisions, often driven by fear of future threats, created tension. He built systems others questioned. He acted preemptively, sometimes without consensus. But despite these conflicts, Tony remained, and over time, the team became something more than a functional alliance. It became a form of belonging, imperfect, incomplete, but real. Tony did not always express this openly,
But his actions began to reflect it. He fought not just to protect the world, but to protect them. And in doing so, he moved closer to something he had rarely experienced, a sense of shared purpose. Natasha Romanoff, The Language of Unspoken Understanding. There are some connections that do not begin with trust. They begin with observation. Natasha Romanoff entered Tony Stark's life not as a friend, but as a watcher, a presence sent to evaluate, to assess, to remain unnoticed while seeing everything. And perhaps that is why their connection developed the way it did. It was never loud, it was never defined by emotional declarations. Natasha understood something about Tony that few others did. She understood masks because she wore them too. Where others saw Tony's humor as personality, Natasha recognized it as deflection. Where others saw arrogance, she saw distance. And instead of trying to break through it forcefully, she allowed it to exist while quietly seeing beyond it. This created a unique dynamic.
They did not rely on constant reassurance. They did not need to define their connection explicitly. There was an understanding, subtle, unspoken, that both carried complicated pasts, that both had made choices they could not fully undo, and that both continued forward, not because they were unburdened, but because they had learned to carry those burdens. Natasha did not attempt to change Tony. She did not demand emotional openness. Instead, she offered presence without pressure. And for Tony, who often withdrew when confronted directly, this kind of connection was easier to accept. It allowed him to remain himself while still being seen. Their relationship was not one of transformation, but of recognition, a quiet acknowledgement between two individuals who understood that some wounds are not meant to be explained, only carried. Bruce Banner, Reflection Through Contrast. Where Natasha mirrored Tony's internal complexity, Bruce Banner offered something different, a reflection through contrast. Both were scientists.
Both were defined by intellect. Both carried responsibility for things they had created and could not fully control. And yet their approaches diverged. Bruce carried caution, a deep awareness of consequence, a reluctance to act without certainty.
Tony carried urgency, a need to solve, to fix, to prevent what might come next, even if the solution was incomplete. This difference created both connection and tension. They understood each other's language. They could speak in ideas, in theories, in possibilities. But understanding did not eliminate disagreement. Their collaboration on Ultron became a defining moment of this dynamic. It was not born from malice. It was born from fear. Tony feared what was coming. Bruce feared what they might unleash. And in choosing to act, Tony crossed a line that Bruce hesitated to approach. When the consequences emerged, their connection shifted. There was no dramatic confrontation, only a quiet recognition that shared intelligence does not guarantee shared judgment.
And yet Bruce did not abandon Tony. He questioned him. He distanced himself when necessary, but he remained part of the same world. Through Bruce, Tony encountered something important, that being understood does not mean being agreed with, and that even those who see you clearly may still stand apart from your choices. Thor, distance bridged by mutual respect. Some relationships begin with difference so vast that connection seems unlikely. Thor and Tony Stark came from entirely different worlds, one grounded in technology, the other in myth. Their early interactions were marked by tension, not personal hostility, but incompatibility. Tony approached problems through invention. Thor approached them through strength and tradition. Tony questioned everything. Thor trusted in what had always been. And yet, over time, this distance softened, not because they became similar, but because they began to respect what made them different. Tony saw in Thor a form of conviction he could not replicate.
Thor saw in Tony a form of ingenuity he could not match. Their relationship did not evolve into closeness, but it evolved into recognition, a quiet understanding that strength takes many forms, and that protection, the thing they both valued, does not require identical paths. Through Thor, Tony learned to accept perspectives that did not align with his own logic, not as flaws, but as alternatives. Nick Fury, trust built on secrecy. If Tony Stark struggled with authority, his relationship with Nick Fury was bound to be complicated. Fury did not approach Tony with openness. He approached him with strategy. From the beginning, their connection was layered with withheld information, calculated decisions, and partial truths. Fury saw Tony not only as a person, but as a piece within a larger design. And Tony sensed that. He resisted being controlled. He questioned motives. Trust did not come easily between them. And yet it formed, not through transparency, but through results. Fury recognized Tony's capacity to grow beyond his past.
Tony recognized Fury's commitment to something larger than individual agendas. Their relationship remained guarded. It was never fully open, never entirely comfortable, but it was functional. And more than that, it was necessary. Through Fury, Tony encountered a different form of connection,
one where trust is not rooted in emotional closeness, but in shared objectives. It was not the kind of relationship Tony sought, but it was one he came to accept. Thanos, conflict as existential reflection. Not all relationships involve understanding. Some exist as pure opposition. Thanos was not a rival in the traditional sense. He was something deeper, a reflection of Tony's fears taken to their extreme. Tony had always feared what might come: invasion, destruction, the failure to protect. These fears drove many of his decisions, including those that created unintended consequences. Thanos embodied those fears. But where Tony sought to prevent loss, Thanos embraced it. Where Tony struggled with responsibility, Thanos redefined it entirely. Their encounter was brief, yet significant.
Because in Thanos, Tony saw what happens when conviction is separated from empathy, when purpose overrides connection. This conflict did not challenge Tony's intellect, it challenged his understanding of balance. It forced him to confront the idea that intention alone does not justify action, and that even the desire to protect can become destructive when taken too far. The shape he left in the world. Before Tony Stark chose to become something more, the world he lived in was already complex, already burdened by conflict and power, but it lacked something crucial, an awareness of consequence at the level he would eventually force it to confront. Stark's earliest influence was not heroic, it was industrial. His name was tied to weapons, to systems designed to project force at a distance, detached from the human cost they carried. And this is where his legacy begins, not with redemption, but with responsibility. Because when Tony Stark changed, the world did not simply receive a new protector.
It was forced to reckon with the idea that those who create power must also answer for it. This shift altered more than policy or perception. It introduced a new expectation into the fabric of the world. Technology was no longer neutral. Intelligence was no longer detached. Innovation itself became something that demanded moral weight. And Stark, perhaps more than anyone, carried that weight openly. He did not hide from his past. He did not rewrite it. Instead, he allowed it to remain visible, almost as a warning. His transformation was not clean, not simple, and because of that, it resonated. It made others question not only what they could build, but whether they should. In time, the world began to change around that question. Governments sought oversight. Organizations attempted control. Individuals, scientists, engineers, thinkers felt the ripple of Stark's example. Some followed it toward responsibility.
Others resisted, believing that power should remain unchecked. This tension did not resolve easily. In fact, it became one of the defining conflicts of the age. And at the center of it was the idea Stark left behind, that intelligence without accountability is not progress, it is risk. A new kind of protector. Iron Man represented something different from traditional heroes. He was not born with power. He was not chosen by destiny or accident. He built himself again and again through iteration, failure, and adaptation. This mattered because it changed how protection was understood in the world.
Strength was no longer something distant or mythical. It became something constructed, something learned, something that could evolve. This made hope more accessible, but it also made fear more immediate. If Tony Stark could build armor that rivaled God's, then others could try to do the same, and many did. The world Stark left behind is filled with echoes of his work.
Some are benevolent, technologies that heal, systems that protect, innovations that connect. Others are far more dangerous, attempts to replicate his designs without his restraint, without his self-awareness. This duality is one of the most important aspects of his legacy. He did not simply create solutions, he created possibilities. And possibilities, once introduced, cannot be contained. Yet even within this uncertainty, there is a quiet stability that Stark provided, a sense that someone, somewhere, was thinking ahead, anticipating threats before they emerged, preparing not just for what existed, but for what might come next. This forward-thinking mindset became part of the world's structure. Defense was no longer reactive, it became predictive. And that shift, subtle but profound, changed how safety itself was defined. The burden of anticipation. One of the most enduring elements of Tony Stark's legacy is not something he built, but something he carried. Fear. Not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that observes, that calculates.
That prepares. Stark lived with the constant awareness that the world could end, not abstractly, but specifically. He imagined threats in detail. He considered outcomes others refused to see. And though this often isolated him, it also drove him to act. In many ways, Tony Stark became a guardian of futures that had not yet happened. This role came at a cost, because to anticipate danger at that level is to never fully rest. It is to exist in a state of quiet vigilance where every moment of peace feels temporary. And yet this vigilance became part of what protected the world. After him, others inherited fragments of this mindset. Some understood it, others struggled with it, but none could ignore it. The idea that safety requires preparation, not just courage, became embedded in those who followed. And so Stark's legacy is not only in what he built, but in how he thought. He taught the world to look forward, even when it was uncomfortable to do so. The legacy within others. Perhaps the most intimate measure of a life is not how it shapes the world at large, but how it shapes individuals. Tony Stark's influence on others was rarely simple. He was not an easy mentor, nor a consistently gentle presence. His guidance often came through challenge, through expectation, through an unspoken belief that others could rise higher than they believed. And because of this, those closest to him were changed in ways that extended far beyond their time with him. Some learned responsibility through him, not as a concept, but as a lived necessity. Others learned resilience, understanding that failure was not an endpoint, but a process. There were those who saw in Stark a reflection of their own potential and their own flaws. And perhaps most importantly, there were those who inherited his unfinished work, not in the form of technology, but in the form of questions.
What does it mean to protect others? How much control is too much? When does preparation become obsession? These questions did not end with Tony Stark. They continued, carried by those who remembered him not as a symbol, but as a person. His legacy in others is not about imitation, it is about continuation. Each individual shaped by him carries forward a different aspect of what he represented. Some carry his ingenuity, others his caution, others still his willingness to change, even when change is painful. In this way, Stark's presence remains active, not static. He does not linger as memory alone, but as influence. A world that remembers. Memory in the world Tony Stark left behind is complex. He is remembered differently depending on where one stands. To some, he is a hero who gave everything to ensure survival. To others, he is a figure of controversy, a man whose decisions reshaped global systems in ways that were not always agreed upon.
And yet, even in disagreement, there is recognition. Recognition that he mattered. Recognition that his actions altered the course of events in ways that cannot be undone. There are physical reminders, structures, technologies, records of his work. But more subtle are the cultural shifts, the way people speak about responsibility, the way innovation is viewed with both hope and caution. These are not monuments, they are habits of thought, and they endure far longer. In quiet moments, when danger feels distant, the world he helped stabilize continues forward without needing to remember him actively. But when uncertainty rises, when new threats emerge, the memory of Tony Stark becomes sharper, not as nostalgia, but as reference, as a reminder of what was required once before, and what may be required again. The meaning beneath the armor. If we look beyond the visible, beyond the suits, the systems, the brilliance, what remains is something far simpler.
Tony Stark's journey represents the possibility of change. Not easy change, not immediate transformation, but gradual, difficult, often uncomfortable growth. He did not begin as someone who understood responsibility fully. He became someone who chose to carry it. And that distinction matters, because it suggests that meaning is not fixed at the beginning of a life. It is built over time, through decisions, through reflection, through the willingness to confront one's own limitations. Stark's life illustrates that intelligence alone is not enough, nor is power, nor even intention. What matters is the integration of all these elements into something coherent, something directed toward others, not just oneself. In this way, his legacy is not confined to a specific world or set of events. It extends outward as an idea that a person can evolve, that mistakes can lead to understanding, that protection at its deepest level is an act of care.
A quiet closing reflection. And so, as the night settles and the world grows still, the image of Tony Stark becomes less about motion and more about presence. Not the presence of a figure in armor standing against overwhelming odds, but the presence of influence woven quietly into the lives and systems that continue after him. The world he helped shape does not remain unchanged. It moves, adapts, evolves. But within that movement, there is a trace, a subtle alignment toward responsibility, toward foresight, toward the understanding that power must always be questioned, even by those who wield it. Tony Stark does not need to be seen to be felt. His legacy exists in the decisions others make when faced with uncertainty, in the hesitation before acting without thought, in the quiet realization that intelligence carries weight and that weight must be carried carefully. And perhaps in the end, that is what he leaves behind. Not perfection, not certainty, but a direction. A gentle, persistent reminder that even in a world of endless complexity, it is still possible to choose to become better than one was before. And in that choice, repeated again and again, his story continues. And when a story continues without its central figure, something subtle begins to emerge. Not absence, but diffusion, the echo that does not fade. After Tony Stark, the world does not fall silent. It becomes quieter in a different way, less defined by a single mind anticipating every outcome, and more shaped by many minds attempting to carry pieces of what he once held alone. This is where legacy deepens, because what Tony Stark represented was never meant to remain singular. His influence begins to scatter, not chaotically, but unevenly, into institutions, into individuals, into systems that now operate with a faint imprint of his thinking. Some of these echoes are deliberate.
Projects he left behind continue to function, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes evolving beyond his original design. These systems reflect his tendency to plan beyond immediate needs. They are not static creations. They adapt, much like he did. But other echoes are less tangible. They exist in hesitation, in the moment before a decision is made, when someone pauses, not out of fear, but out of awareness. A quiet question forms. What are the consequences of this? That question did not always exist so clearly. Tony Stark made it unavoidable. The fragility of progress. Yet legacy is not always stable. The world he helped shape is stronger, yes, more prepared, more aware, but it is also more complicated. Because the very ideas Stark introduced, accountability, foresight, technological responsibility, are not easy to maintain. They require constant attention, and without him, there is no singular force ensuring that attention remains focused. Some begin to interpret his legacy differently. There are those who believe that Stark's caution was necessary only in his time, that the future requires a different approach, one less burdened by hesitation, more driven by expansion. Others hold tightly to his example, perhaps too tightly, attempting to replicate his methods without fully understanding the reasoning behind them. Both responses reveal something important. Legacy does not preserve intention perfectly. It transforms as it is carried forward. And so the world becomes a place where Tony Stark is remembered, but not always understood in the same way.
This creates tension, not destructive tension, but a kind that demands continual reflection. Because to truly inherit something meaningful, one must not only remember what was done, but why it was done. The quiet inheritance of responsibility. Among those most deeply affected by Tony Stark's life, there exists a quieter form of inheritance. It is not the inheritance of wealth or technology or status. It is the inheritance of responsibility.
Those who stood close to him, who saw the weight he carried, the doubts he rarely voiced openly, begin to recognize that his greatest contribution was not what he built, but what he accepted. He accepted that he could not control everything, and yet he chose to try, not through domination, but through preparation. This distinction is subtle but essential, because control seeks to eliminate uncertainty. Preparation acknowledges it. And those who understand this difference begin to approach the world differently. They do not aim to become Tony Stark. They aim to carry forward the mindset that defined his later years, a mindset grounded not in confidence alone, but in awareness. This awareness manifests in small ways, in decisions that prioritize long-term stability over short-term gain, in actions that consider not only immediate impact, but extended consequence, in the willingness to step back, to reassess, to question even one's own intentions. These are not dramatic changes, they are quiet adjustments.
But over time, they shape the world just as powerfully as any invention, the human measure of a legacy. It is easy when speaking of someone like Tony Stark to focus on scale, global impact, technological advancement, historical significance. But there is another measure, one far more intimate, how a person changes the way others see themselves. Tony Stark, in his complexity, offered no perfect model. He was flawed, openly so. His confidence could become arrogance. His foresight could become anxiety. His determination could become isolation. And yet, within these contradictions, there was something deeply human. He did not present an unattainable ideal. He presented a possibility, that a person could begin imperfectly and still move towards something meaningful. This is the part of his legacy that resonates most quietly, because it does not require extraordinary ability to understand. It requires recognition. Recognition that growth is not linear, that responsibility is learned, often through failure.
That meaning is not something one discovers fully formed, but something one constructs over time. For those who reflect on Tony Stark not as a symbol, but as a person, this understanding becomes deeply personal. It shifts how they view their own choices, their own potential for change, their own capacity to contribute, even in small ways. The balance between fear and hope. One of the most delicate aspects of Tony Stark's legacy lies in how it balances two opposing forces, fear and hope. Stark was deeply aware of what could go wrong. He saw threats others overlooked. He imagined outcomes others dismissed. This awareness often placed him at odds with those around him, creating distance where connection might have been easier. And yet, despite this, he did not withdraw. He acted. This is where hope enters, not as optimism, but as persistence.
the belief that even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty, action still matters.
After him, the world inherits both of these elements, the caution born from understanding risk and the determination to act despite it. Maintaining this balance is not simple. Too much fear leads to paralysis. Too much hope leads to recklessness. But in the space between them, there is a kind of clarity, a recognition that progress requires both awareness and courage. This balance becomes one of the most enduring aspects of what Tony Stark leaves behind. It is not something that can be taught directly. It must be experienced, adjusted, refined over time. And in that process, his influence continues, not as instruction, but as guidance. Time and the softening of memory. As years pass, the sharper edges of memory begin to soften. The urgency of Tony Stark's actions becomes less immediate. The debates, the tensions, the difficult decisions, these begin to settle into history. What remains is something quieter, a sense of presence without the weight of immediacy. Stories are told,
Not always with complete accuracy, but with a certain tone, a recognition that what he did mattered. In these retellings, some details fade, but the essence remains, that he changed, that he tried, that he carried more than was asked of him, and that, in the end, he gave more than was expected. This softened memory allows for reflection without urgency, for understanding without pressure. It creates space for those who come after to interpret his legacy in their own way, not as something fixed, but as something living. What remains when everything moves on? And so we arrive at the quietest part of this reflection, the place where action has ended, but meaning continues. The world does not stop. It continues forward, shaped by countless influences, countless decisions, countless individuals, each carrying their own burdens. Tony Stark becomes part of that ongoing motion, not as a central force, but as a foundational one.
His presence is no longer immediate, but it is not gone. It exists in structure, in mindset, in the subtle ways people choose to act when faced with uncertainty. And perhaps most importantly, it exists in the understanding that change is possible, that a person can begin one way and become something else entirely, not perfectly, but meaningfully. A final gentle thought. As the night deepens and the world settles into stillness, it becomes easier to see legacy not as something grand, but as something quiet, a series of influences carried forward in small, consistent ways. Tony Stark does not stand at the center of the world he helped shape. He rests at its edges, present but not imposing, remembered but not overwhelming. And in that position, he continues to guide, not through instruction, but through example. A reminder that intelligence must be tempered with responsibility, that power must be questioned even by those who hold it. And that change, true, lasting change, is always possible, even when it is difficult, even when it is incomplete, even when it comes late. And so, the story does not end. It softens, it settles, and it continues, quietly, gently, in the choices that follow. And in that quiet continuation, something even more subtle begins to take form. Not just the continuation of Tony Stark's influence, but the quiet reinterpretation of it, the legacy that learns without him. A legacy, once released into the world, no longer belongs to the one who created it. It becomes something others engage with, question, reshape. And this is where Tony Stark's presence becomes most interesting. Because the world does not simply preserve what he stood for, it begins to test it. There are moments when his approach is followed closely, his emphasis on preparation, on accountability, on thinking several steps ahead becomes a guiding principle. In these moments, his legacy feels stable, almost anchored.
But there are also moments when his ideas are challenged, when others ask whether constant vigilance is sustainable, whether anticipating every possible threat is a burden too heavy to carry indefinitely. These questions are not a rejection of Stark. They are, in a way, a continuation of his mindset, because Tony Stark himself never accepted ideas without testing them, even his own. And so the world learns to evolve his legacy rather than preserve it unchanged. This evolution is quiet, but it is essential, because a legacy that cannot adapt eventually fades. The weight of being remembered. To be remembered is not always a simple thing, especially for someone like Tony Stark. Memory, over time, simplifies. It smooths out contradictions. It reduces complexity. It turns a life into a narrative that is easier to understand, but often less complete. And yet, for those who knew him, or who study his life closely, the complexity remains.
They remember that Stark was not always certain, that behind his precision there was doubt, that behind his confidence there was fear. This more nuanced memory becomes its own kind of inheritance, because it resists the temptation to turn him into something unreachable. Instead, it preserves his humanity, and in doing so, it keeps his legacy accessible, not as a standard that cannot be met, but as a path that can be walked, imperfectly, gradually, honestly. The unfinished nature of protection. One of the quiet truths Tony Stark leaves behind is that protection is never complete. There is no final solution, no system that guarantees absolute safety. Stark understood this, even as he tried to move closer to it. He built, improved, adjusted, always aware that what worked today might not work tomorrow. This awareness becomes part of the world's ongoing mindset. Those who follow do not seek perfection, they seek readiness. They understand that every solution introduces new variables, that every advancement carries unintended consequences. And rather than seeing this as failure, they begin to see it as part of the process. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything, because it replaces the expectation of control with the acceptance of responsibility. And responsibility, unlike control, can be sustained, it can be shared, it can evolve. The silence between actions. In many ways, Tony Stark was defined by what he did, but his legacy is often felt most strongly in what happens between actions, in the pauses, in the decisions that are never publicly visible. The choice not to act impulsively, the choice to reconsider, the choice to listen even when one believes they are right.
These moments do not attract attention. They do not become headlines, but they shape outcomes in ways that are just as important as any visible intervention. And after Stark, these quiet moments begin to carry more weight.
Because those who reflect on his life understand that not every impact comes from action. Some come from restraint, from patience, from the willingness to step back and allow a situation to unfold rather than forcing it into resolution. This is a more difficult lesson to learn, but it is one of the most enduring. The subtle redefinition of strength. Before Tony Stark, strength was often understood in clear, visible terms: physical power, tactical advantage, the ability to overcome. Stark did not remove these ideas, but he expanded them. He introduced a different dimension of strength, one that is less visible but equally important. The strength to acknowledge uncertainty, the strength to admit when something is beyond one's understanding, the strength to change course even after committing to a path. These forms of strength are not easily recognized. They do not create immediate impact, but over time they create stability. They allow systems to adapt. They allow individuals to grow, and they prevent the kind of rigidity that leads to failure. This redefinition of strength becomes part of the world Stark leaves behind, not universally accepted, but increasingly understood. A legacy without ownership. Perhaps one of the most profound aspects of Tony Stark's legacy is that it cannot be owned. It is not contained within a single organization or a single individual or a single philosophy. It exists across many spaces, in many forms, and because of this, it resists simplification. Some will interpret his legacy as a call to innovate. Others will see it as a warning about the dangers of unchecked advancement. Some will focus on his sacrifices, others on his mistakes. All of these interpretations are valid and incomplete, because Tony Stark's life does not point in a single direction. It creates a field of possibilities, and within that field, each person chooses what to carry forward. This lack of ownership ensures that his legacy remains dynamic. It prevents it from becoming static or dogmatic. It allows it to remain relevant even as the world changes. The quiet continuation of meaning. And so, as time continues to pass, Tony Stark's presence becomes less about recognition and more about integration. He is no longer something the world looks at. He is something the world moves through. His ideas, his choices, his approach to responsibility, they become part of the environment, not always noticed, but always present. And in this quiet integration, his legacy achieves something rare. It becomes sustainable, not dependent on memory alone, but supported by practice, by the daily decisions of those who, knowingly or not, reflect a piece of what he represented. A final reflection in the stillness. As the night settles deeper and the rhythm of the world slows, the meaning of Tony Stark's legacy becomes clearer, not through grand statements, but through quiet understanding. He did not leave behind perfection. He did not create a world free of conflict. He did not solve every problem he tried to address. What he left behind was something far more enduring, a shift in how people think, in how they approach power,
in how they understand responsibility, and perhaps most importantly, in how they view change. Because Tony Stark showed that change is not a single moment. It is a process, a continuous, often difficult process of becoming more aware, more responsible, more aligned with something beyond oneself. And in that process, repeated quietly across time, his story continues, not loudly, not visibly, but steadily, like a soft current beneath the surface of the world, guiding it gently towards something better. And as that gentle current continues to move beneath the surface, there comes a point where legacy is no longer something that needs to be remembered consciously. It simply becomes part of how the world works. When influence becomes invisible, there is a stage in every lasting legacy where it stops feeling like an influence and starts feeling like a norm. The ideas Tony Stark carried, responsibility tied to intelligence, foresight paired with action, caution balanced with courage, begin to fade into the background of everyday thinking. People no longer ask, "What would Stark have done?" Instead, they begin to ask, "What is the responsible choice here?" And without realizing it, they are already echoing him. This is perhaps the most complete form of legacy. Not recognition, not admiration, but integration. Because once an idea becomes part of the structure of thought itself, it no longer needs to be defended or explained. It simply exists. The absence that creates space. Yet even as his influence becomes quieter, his absence remains meaningful. There is no one who replaces Tony Stark, no singular figure who takes on the same role, carries the same weight, or thinks in exactly the same way.
And this absence is not a weakness, it is an opening. Because where one voice once defined direction, many voices now contribute. Different perspectives emerge, different approaches develop. Some are slower, some are more cautious, some are more collaborative. The world becomes less dependent on a single mind and more resilient as a result. This shift reflects something Stark himself may have understood, even if he struggled with it. That true protection cannot rely on one individual. It must become shared, distributed, carried forward collectively. And in his absence, that transition finally takes hold. The memory that guides without leading. Even when Tony Stark is no longer present in action, his memory continues to guide in a quieter way. Not as instruction, but as reference. When uncertainty rises, when decisions become complex, there is often a moment, brief, almost unspoken, where his example surfaces. Not in detail, but in essence, a reminder to think ahead.
To consider consequences. To act with intention. This kind of guidance is different from leadership. It does not direct, it suggests. And because it is not imposed, it allows for interpretation. Each person who reflects on Stark's life draws something slightly different from it, and this diversity of interpretation ensures that his legacy does not become rigid. It remains flexible, responsive, alive. The quiet lessons that remain. If one were to gather the lessons Tony Stark leaves behind,
They would not form a simple list. They would not align neatly into a set of rules. Instead, they would exist as patterns, patterns that repeat across situations, across decisions, across time. The pattern of questioning power before using it, the pattern of preparing for outcomes rather than reacting to them, the pattern of accepting responsibility even when it is uncomfortable. These patterns are not always followed. They are not universally understood.
But they persist, and over time they shape behavior in ways that are often subtle but deeply significant. The enduring presence of imperfection. One of the most important and often overlooked aspects of Tony Stark's legacy is that it does not erase imperfection. In fact, it highlights it. Stark's life was not defined by flawless decisions. It was defined by the willingness to respond to flawed ones, to adjust, to reconsider, to try again. This aspect of his legacy becomes especially important as others attempt to carry forward his influence, because it removes the pressure to replicate him perfectly. It allows for growth to remain central. It acknowledges that mistakes are not a failure of legacy, but part of its continuation. In this way, his imperfections become one of his most valuable contributions. They make his legacy sustainable because they make it human. The gentle expansion of meaning. As time continues, the meaning of Tony Stark's life expands, not in scale, but in depth. New generations encounter his story not as something immediate, but as something reflective. They do not experience the urgency he lived with. They experience the understanding that follows it. And through this distance, new interpretations emerge. Some focus on his transformation, others on his responsibility, others still on the balance he tried to maintain between control and acceptance. Each interpretation adds another layer to his legacy, not replacing what came before, but building upon it. And in this gradual expansion, his influence continues to grow, not louder, but deeper. A final stillness. And now, as everything settles, as the movement of time carries the world further away from the moments that defined Tony Stark's life, what remains is something quiet. Not a figure in motion, not a voice giving direction, but a presence, gently embedded in the way the world thinks, decides, and moves forward. Tony Stark does not stand at the center anymore. He does not need to. Because what he contributed has already taken root in systems, in people, in ideas that continue to unfold. And in that quiet unfolding, there is a kind of peace, a sense that even though he's no longer there to act, what he stood for has not disappeared. It has simply been carried forward in small decisions, in careful thoughts, in moments where someone pauses and chooses responsibility over ease. And so, as the night deepens and the world rests, his legacy remains, not as something to hold on to tightly, but as something to move with, softly, steadily, and without needing to be seen at all. And in that unseen movement, there's one final layer to consider. Not what Tony Stark left behind in the world, but what the world, quietly,
continues to learn about itself because of him. The world learning to carry its own weight. For a long time, the presence of Tony Stark created a kind of gravitational center, not through authority alone, but through expectation.
There was an unspoken understanding that if something grew too complex, too dangerous, too uncertain, Stark would already be thinking about it, already preparing, already building something that might help. And when that center is gone, the world must adjust. It must learn to distribute that expectation, to accept that no single mind will anticipate everything, that no one will quietly remain several steps ahead on behalf of everyone else. This realization is not immediate. It arrives gradually through moments of uncertainty where the absence is felt most clearly. And in those moments, something important begins to shift. Responsibility moves outward. It becomes shared, not evenly, not perfectly, but undeniably. People begin to recognize that waiting for someone else to solve the problem is no longer an option, that participation, thoughtful, imperfect, ongoing, is necessary. And in this way, Tony Stark's absence does something his presence could not fully achieve. It teaches the world to stand without leaning.
The quiet courage of continuation. There is a particular kind of courage required to continue without certainty. Tony Stark often acted in moments where outcomes were unclear, where risks were significant, where success was not guaranteed. After him, that same uncertainty remains, but the context changes. Now, those who act do so without the reassurance of his presence, without the quiet belief that if something goes wrong, there is someone else who can correct it. This creates a different kind of courage, less dramatic, more sustained. It is the courage of consistency, of continuing to make thoughtful decisions over time, even when results are not immediate, of holding to principles that may not always be rewarded quickly. This form of courage is less visible, but more enduring, and it becomes one of the most important ways his legacy lives on, not through singular acts of heroism, but through steady, deliberate effort.
The relationship between power and restraint. One of the most delicate balances Tony Stark explored was the relationship between what could be done and what should be done. This tension does not disappear after him. If anything, it becomes more pronounced, because the technologies and ideas he introduced continued to develop. They become more accessible, more widespread, more integrated into everyday life. And with this expansion comes increased complexity. Decisions are no longer isolated. They ripple outward, affecting systems, communities, environments. The need for restraint becomes more critical, but also more difficult, because restraint requires self-awareness. It requires the ability to pause, to question, to reconsider, even when action seems easier. Tony Stark's life did not resolve this tension, but it illuminated it. And after him, the world continues to navigate that space. Not always successfully, but with a growing awareness that power without reflection is incomplete. The enduring question of enough. Perhaps one of the most human aspects of Tony Stark's journey is his struggle with the idea of enough. Enough preparation,
Enough protection,
enough control? This question does not have a clear answer, and it does not disappear with him. Those who reflect on his life begin to encounter the same uncertainty. How much preparation is necessary before it becomes excessive? How much control is helpful before it becomes limiting? How much responsibility can one person carry before it becomes overwhelming? These questions do not resolve easily. They require continuous reflection, adjustment, balance. And in this ongoing process, Stark's legacy becomes less about providing answers and more about encouraging the search for them. The soft persistence of influence. Influence, when it is lasting, does not need to assert itself. It persists quietly, through patterns of thought, through habits of action, through the subtle ways individuals approach complexity and responsibility. Tony Stark's influence takes this form. It does not dominate, it does not demand attention, but it remains. In the engineer who considers the ethical implications of a new design.
In the leader who pauses before making a decision that affects others. In the individual who chooses to learn from a mistake rather than ignore it. These moments are small, often unnoticed, but they accumulate, and over time they create a culture, an environment shaped not by a single person, but by a shared understanding. The world that continues thoughtfully. And so the world continues, not perfectly, not without conflict, but with a slightly different orientation, a little more aware, a little more reflective, a little more inclined to consider consequence alongside action. Tony Stark does not ensure this outcome. He does not control it, but he contributes to it in ways that extend beyond his direct influence, in ways that continue to unfold long after his presence has become memory. A final resting thought. Now, as everything settles into stillness once more, as the quiet rhythm of the night returns.
There is one final understanding that remains. Tony Stark's legacy is not something that asks to be remembered constantly. It does not require attention. It does not depend on recognition. It exists whether it is noticed or not, in the spaces between decisions, in the moments of reflection before action, in the quiet realization that intelligence, power, and responsibility are not separate things, but parts of a single whole. And perhaps that is the most enduring meaning of his life. Not that he changed the world entirely, but that he shifted how the world understands change itself as something ongoing, something shared, something that requires care. And as the night deepens and the world rests, that understanding remains, softly, steadily, and without needing to be seen at all.